A story about what happens when 30 engineers can't fix what one maintenance worker already understood. When the servers started dying, nobody looked at the guy holding the wrench. They should have. If you've ever been dismissed, talked over, or made to feel invisible because of what you wear or where you stand, this story is going to hit different. Stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Follow along. You won't want to miss what happens next. Quote, the first alarm went off at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, and nobody in the building paid it much attention. That was the problem. In the operations center on the 14th floor of Meridian Financial Technologies, a company that processed somewhere north of $400 million in digital transactions every single day, a blinking amber light had been sitting in the corner of Monitor 7 for the better part of 3 hours. The engineers on duty had already flagged it, already run the standard diagnostic, and already decided it wasn't urgent. One of them had actually written non-critical threshold variance in the incident log at 7:12 a.m., gone to get a coffee, and come back to find the light still blinking and done nothing else about it. By 9:47, the amber light had turned red. By 9:51, there were 9 red lights. By 9:53, the entire transaction processing cluster, the beating heart of a platform that 42,000 business clients depended on, had begun a cascading failure that the 30 best-paid engineers in the company could not explain, could not slow down, and could not stop. Ryan Carter was in sublevel B when the building started losing its mind. He was crouched behind a cooling unit the size of a refrigerator, tightening a compression fitting that had been weeping coolant for the past 2 days. He had already flagged the issue twice in the maintenance ticketing system. The first ticket had been closed without action. The second one had been reassigned to a facilities vendor who hadn't shown up. So Ryan had come in early, grabbed his own tools, and dealt with it himself, because that was generally how things got done when you worked maintenance at a place like Meridian. He heard the alarms before he saw anything, not the soft procedural beeps that usually meant a UPS test or a fire drill. These were the sharp, layered tones of multiple systems failing at once, the kind of sound that didn't belong in a building full of redundancies and fail-safes. Ryan set down his wrench, wiped his hands on the front of his work pants, and stood up. Through the reinforced glass partition that separated the server corridor from the cooling infrastructure, he could already see people moving fast. Not the purposeful fast of engineers running a drill, the directionless fast of people who didn't know what they were running toward. He picked up his tool bag and walked toward the door. Fuck. The operations center looked like it had been hit by something invisible. Screens that had been showing clean green dashboards 40 minutes ago were now a collage of red and orange alerts, scrolling error codes faster than anyone could read them. 3 engineers were on phones simultaneously. 2 others were physically arguing near the main console about whether to initiate a rollback. A 4th was typing so fast his chair kept rolling backward from the desk, and he kept pulling himself back in without breaking rhythm, like some kind of frantic metronome. Marcus Webb, the head of infrastructure engineering, was standing in the center of the room with both hands pressed flat on a table, staring at a screen with the expression of a man watching his car roll slowly into a lake. "We roll back," he said again, to nobody in particular. "We can't roll back, Marcus. The snapshot is corrupted. Then we pull the plug on the upgrade cluster and failover to..." Failovers throwing dependency errors. The upgrade touched shared libraries. How did the upgrade touch shared libraries? That wasn't in the change request. I don't know how, but it did, and now everything that touches the payment router is... Okay. Marcus straightened up. He pressed 2 fingers against his temple. Someone call Olivia. Nobody moved immediately. Calling Olivia Bennett at 9:54 in the morning because the infrastructure was collapsing was not something anyone in that room wanted to do. Olivia Bennett was 30 years old, had been running Meridian Financial Technologies for 2 years, and had a reputation for asking questions that revealed exactly how much you didn't know about your own systems. She had fired 2 directors in her first 6 months, not in anger, not dramatically, just quietly and efficiently, after a series of meetings where they failed to demonstrate that they understood what they were responsible for. Marcus picked up his own phone. Ryan Carter had reached the operations center door by then. He didn't have an access badge for this floor. Maintenance was sub-level, first floor, occasionally second floor. He had followed a group of engineers through the door when they'd pushed through in a hurry, and now he was standing near the back of the room, close to the wall, watching the monitors. He could see what was wrong. It wasn't subtle once you knew what you were looking at. The traffic routing table on the secondary screen, the one nobody was currently watching because everyone was focused on the transaction errors, was showing a feedback pattern he recognized. A loop that shouldn't exist, feeding back into itself, consuming bandwidth that should have been distributing to client-facing endpoints. Every second it ran, it was eating resources and starving the processors that actually handled money movement. It had probably started as a minor misconfiguration in the upgrade. Something small. A parameter value in a routing policy maybe, or an incorrect priority setting in the load balancer configuration. On its own, it would have just slowed things down. But combined with the shared library changes Marcus's team apparently hadn't fully tracked, and running on infrastructure that was already stressed by a Tuesday morning peak load, it had become something that fed on itself. Ryan had actually seen this pattern before. Not here, but somewhere else, a long time ago, in code he had written himself. He took a few steps closer to the nearest unused terminal. "Hey!" A hand on his shoulder, firm enough to spin him around. It was one of the junior engineers, a guy Ryan had seen in the hallways before but didn't know by name. Late 20s, Meridian polo shirt, a look on his face that was somewhere between panicked and territorial. "This floor is restricted. Who are you?" "Maintenance," Ryan said. "I was downstairs when—" "Yeah, you need to leave. This isn't a spectator situation." "I'm not spectating." Ryan kept his voice flat. "The routing table on monitor 3 is showing a feedback loop. That's what's driving the cascade. If someone pushes a corrected priority weight to the load balancer config, you can break the loop before—" "Okay." The engineer was already turning away. "Thanks for the input. Please exit through the stairwell." Ryan stayed where he was. The engineer glanced back. "Sir, I need you to—" "Your transaction errors aren't the problem," Ryan said, slightly louder. Not aggressive, just clear. "They're a symptom. You're trying to treat the symptom. The feedback loop is going to consume your remaining processing capacity in—" He looked at the monitor. "Somewhere around 8 minutes, maybe 10 if your peak load drops off. After that, it won't matter what you do to the transaction layer. You won't have anything left to work with." Two other engineers nearby had turned to look at him now, not with interest, with the particular expression people make when a stranger has said something unexpected in a room where everyone is too busy to deal with unexpected things. Marcus Webb looked up from his table. "Who is that?" he said. "Maintenance contractor," the junior engineer said. "I'm handling it." He came in with, "I'm handling it." Ryan didn't move. Marcus stared at him for a second, then went back to his phone. "Olivia? Yeah, I know what time it is. We have a problem." Olivia Bennett arrived on the 14th floor in 11 minutes, which was faster than it should have been, which meant she had probably been somewhere in the building when Marcus called. She came through the door in a dark blazer over a white shirt, hair pulled back, and took about 4 seconds to read the room before she walked directly to Marcus. She was not visibly alarmed. She had the quality that certain people develop after spending years in high-pressure environments, a kind of surface stillness that didn't mean she wasn't processing everything at speed. It just meant she'd learned that showing alarm made other people's panic worse. "Talk to me," she said. Marcus talked. Transaction processing down. Cascade failure across the payment routing cluster. 31 engineers, no confirmed fix. They'd already lost 2 enterprise clients who had detected the outage and called their account managers. A third was threatening to pull their contract. Olivia listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, she said, "What's the projected recovery timeline?" "We don't have one." She looked at him. "We're still diagnosing," he said. "It's been—" She checked her watch. "At least 40 minutes since the first alerts. 31 engineers, and we're still diagnosing. The upgrade introduced unexpected dependencies. I approved that upgrade after a full review meeting where your team told me the risk was low." "Yes, and I'm not interested in the history right now, Marcus. I need a timeline." The room had gotten quieter around them. People were still working, but the working had become quieter, more careful. The way people work when they know they're being watched by someone whose opinion of them matters. Ryan was still near the back wall. He had done the math twice in his head. 6 minutes, maybe 7, before the feedback loop consumed enough bandwidth to make the load balancer response times climb past the point of recovery. After that, even a perfect fix would take 15 to 20 minutes to propagate, and by then the client-facing systems would be throwing errors fast enough that the transaction backlog alone would take hours to clear. He thought about leaving. He really did. He'd had enough experiences in this kind of room to know how they usually went, who got listened to, who didn't, and the general relationship between those outcomes and what a person was wearing when they walked in. His work shirt had his name embroidered on the left chest. Ryan. Below that, the Meridian Contractor logo and the word maintenance. He walked toward Marcus Webb anyway. "Excuse me." He said it at normal volume, not trying to project, not performing anything. Just 2 words delivered to the back of Marcus's head. Marcus turned around. Olivia turned around with him. Ryan looked at both of them, then at the monitoring screen behind them. "The transaction errors are coming from a feedback loop in your routing table. Monitor 3. It started when the upgrade's load balancer configuration inherited an incorrect priority weight from the shared library changes, the ones that weren't in the original change request." He paused. "You've got maybe 6 minutes before the loop consumes enough bandwidth to take the load balancer offline. If that happens, you're looking at a manual rebuild that takes most of the day." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Marcus said, "Who are you?" "Ryan Carter. I do maintenance and electrical contracting for the building." The silence had a different texture after that. It wasn't the silence of people considering what he'd said. It was the silence of people deciding what to do with the fact that a maintenance contractor had just walked up and told the head of infrastructure engineering what was wrong with his system. One of the engineers near the console, older guy, gray at the temples, the kind of person who had been doing this long enough to develop opinions, made a sound that was almost a laugh. "The maintenance guy wants to diagnose the routing table." "I'm not diagnosing it," Ryan said. "I'm telling you what's wrong." "Right." The engineer turned back to his screen. Marcus looked at Ryan for a moment with the expression of a man performing a calculation. Then he looked at Olivia. Olivia was studying Ryan. Not the way most people in that room had looked at him, as an obstacle or an anomaly or something to be managed, something more careful than that. "How do you know what's on our routing table?" she said. "I've been in this building for 8 months, Ryan said. "I've worked in every subsystem room from sublevel B to floor 16. When you run electrical maintenance in a building like this, you end up learning the infrastructure. Learning the infrastructure isn't the same as reading a routing table." "No," Ryan said. "That part comes from somewhere else." She waited. He didn't elaborate. "Okay," Marcus said, drawing the word out in a way that made it clear he was reclaiming control of the conversation. "Thank you for the input. My team is on it." He turned away. "Your team has been on it for 40 minutes, Ryan said. Marcus stopped. Ryan didn't have any particular desire to make enemies in this room. He was conscious of the fact that he worked in this building, that Marcus Webb had the authority to make that arrangement uncomfortable, and that nothing about the way this was going suggested anyone here was going to thank him for being right. But he'd done the math twice, and he was going to do it again right now, and the answer was still 6 minutes, 5.5, and there were 42,000 businesses on the other side of those failing servers that had no idea any of this was happening. "If you want to verify it first," Ryan said, "I understand. Pull up the routing priority weights in the load balancer config. Filter by the entries modified in the last 24 hours. You'll find a value that should be set to 10 sitting at 100. That's the one." He said it quietly. Just the facts. No drama. The older engineer at the console, the one who'd almost laughed, had gone still. He was already looking at his screen. His name was Derek Holt, and he'd been with Meridian for 6 years, which made him one of the longest tenured people in the room. He had the specific self-assurance of someone who had been competent at something for long enough that he'd started to mistake competence for comprehensiveness, that slightly dangerous condition where knowing a lot starts feeling like knowing everything. He pulled up the load balancer configuration. He filtered by modification date. He found the priority weight entries. His hands went still on the keyboard. "Marcus," he said. Marcus turned. Derek didn't say anything else. He just moved aside so Marcus could see the screen. The value was 100. It should have been 10. Ryan watched Marcus stare at it, watched the moment of recognition move across his face. Not just that Ryan was right about this specific thing, but the larger implication behind it. The fact that a man in a maintenance uniform had identified in 45 seconds something that 30 engineers had missed for 40 minutes. Fix it, Olivia said. It's not just changing the value, Marcus said, and the uncertainty in his voice was something new. Up until about 60 seconds ago, he'd been functioning on the energy that comes from authority, even when that authority doesn't have answers. Now the ground had shifted. We need to verify the propagation path, make sure there aren't other inherited values in the... Tell me what needs to happen, Ryan said. Step by step, I'll tell you if the path is clear. Everyone looked at him again. Olivia said, Mr. Carter. Her voice was measured, not quite cold, not quite warm, sitting somewhere in the careful middle. What exactly is your background? Does it matter right now? Ryan said. The room felt the edge in that, not aggression. Just the honest prioritization of a person who was watching a clock no one else seemed to be watching. Olivia held his gaze for a moment. Something shifted in hers, almost imperceptibly. No, she said. It doesn't. Marcus, give him access to the terminal. Marcus did not look happy about it. He looked like a man trying to decide how angry to be and concluding that he didn't currently have the luxury. He nodded at Derek, who stepped aside from the secondary console with the expression of someone setting down something heavy. Ryan pulled the chair out and sat down. He hadn't sat at a terminal in a professional capacity in over 3 years. The software architecture was different from what he'd worked on directly, but the underlying infrastructure logic was familiar in the bone-deep way that things become familiar when you've spent years building their predecessors. He could feel his way through it without thinking about the feeling. He opened the configuration manager, pulled up the routing policy tree, traced the propagation chain from the corrupted priority weight backward through the shared library dependencies to find every downstream process that had inherited the bad value. There were 7 of them. Okay, he said, more to himself than anyone else. The primary value is the load balancer weight, but it propagated to the traffic distribution policy, the failover priority queue, and 4 of the endpoint routing chains. He was typing as he talked, not reading from notes, not hesitating. Fixing just the primary weight would have stabilized the loop, but created a priority inversion in the failover queue. You'd have solved the cascade and caused a different failure in about 20 minutes. The room was very quiet. So I'm fixing all 7 simultaneously, Ryan said, through a configuration group commit. When I push it, the loop breaks in about 90 seconds as the changes propagate. There may be a brief spike in error rates as the load balancer recalibrates, maybe 10 seconds. Then it should stabilize. He looked up, found Marcus. Is there anything touching the routing policy tree that isn't on this screen? He asked. Marcus stared at him. There's a legacy module. Payments reconciliation. It has a separate policy hook that was excluded from the main upgrade. Is it currently in use? It runs a batch job every 15 minutes. Ryan checked the system clock. Last batch ran 4 minutes ago. We have 11 minutes before the next one. That's enough time. He looked back at the screen. I need to include the reconciliation policy hook in the group commit, or the batch job will pull the old priority values and reinitialize the loop. Do you have access to that module's config? Marcus hesitated for exactly long enough that Olivia said, Marcus. Yes, Marcus said. He walked to another terminal and began typing. The engineers who weren't actively working had mostly stopped pretending to work. They were watching Ryan. The room had the atmosphere of a place where something unexpected was happening that nobody had a comfortable framework for. Not the emergency itself, which they were trained for, but the specific shape this emergency had taken, which none of them had any training for at all. Ryan worked without rushing. He was precise in the way that people are precise when they've stopped worrying about looking precise and are just doing what the task requires. He built the configuration group. He included the reconciliation hook values Marcus had found. He ran a propagation simulation on the test environment branch. Took 40 seconds. Watched it execute cleanly, watched the simulated feedback loop break at the point of the corrected priority weights, watched the error rates in the simulation drop to 0 and stay there. He looked at the results for a moment. Then he looked at Olivia. "It's going to work," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a boast. Just a statement of fact delivered with the flatness of someone who had checked it twice and was satisfied. Olivia looked at the simulation results on his screen. She wasn't an infrastructure engineer, she'd come up through finance and strategy, but she knew how to read numbers on a dashboard, and the dashboard was showing her exactly what Ryan said it would show her. "Push it," she said. He pushed the configuration group at 10:08 a.m. For the first 7 seconds, nothing visible changed. The red lights on the monitoring panels kept doing what they'd been doing. The error counts kept climbing. Someone near the back of the room made an involuntary sound, something between a breath and a word, and then stopped themselves. Then the load balancer recalibration spike hit. Error rates jumped sharply for 9 seconds. Several screens flashed new alerts. 2 engineers moved reflexively toward their keyboards and then stopped, because there was nothing to do, because the man at the terminal had told them this would happen, and it was happening exactly the way he'd said it would happen. At second 10, the routing priority corrections began propagating. At second 16, the first feedback loop indicators dropped to 0. At second 38, the cascading error counts began falling. At second 62, the transaction processing cluster came back online. At second 89, every red light in the operations center had turned green. The room didn't cheer. It was the kind of silence that comes after something very large has stopped. The specific quiet of people who have been running on adrenaline for 45 minutes and suddenly have no place to put it. Ryan leaned back in the chair. He wasn't doing anything dramatic with his face. He was tired, actually. He'd been at the building since 6 in the morning, had been on his knees behind a cooling unit for 2 hours before any of this started, and the particular kind of concentration he'd just spent was the kind that cost something afterward. He was aware that his hands were not entirely steady. He looked at the screens for a moment longer. Everything green. The transaction processing metrics climbing back toward normal baseline. Client-facing endpoints responding. The system was not perfectly healthy yet. It would need monitoring, and there was cleanup to do in the reconciliation logs. But it was running, it was stable, and it was not going to fall off a cliff in the next few minutes. He stood up from the terminal. Derek Holt was standing about 4 feet away, and when Ryan stood, Derek's eyes dropped to the embroidered name on Ryan's work shirt and then back up to his face, and Derek didn't say anything, but something moved through his expression that wasn't comfortable to look at. Marcus Webb was still at his own terminal, looking at the monitoring dashboard. The screens were green. He had the posture of a man deciding how to exist in a room he'd entered under very different circumstances than the ones currently present. Olivia was watching Ryan. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Ryan," he said. "Ryan." She paused for a moment, choosing something. "Thank you." It was a strange 2 words in a strange room. Not insufficient exactly. She meant them, and he could tell she meant them, but carrying the weight of everything that wasn't being said around them. The 40 minutes and the 30 engineers and the almost laugh from Derek Holt and the junior engineer who had put his hand on Ryan's shoulder and told him to exit through the stairwell. The reconciliation batch job is going to run in. Ryan checked the clock. About 9 minutes. Someone should monitor the priority weights when it runs and make sure nothing inherited the old values from a cached policy reference. "I'll handle it," Derek said quietly. He didn't look at Ryan when he said it. Ryan picked up his tool bag from where he'd left it near the wall. "The compression fitting in sublevel B is repaired," he said, mostly to the room, to nobody in particular. "But the coolant reservoir in server corridor C is running about 12% low. It's not critical, but someone should top it off before Thursday." He walked toward the door. "Ryan!" Olivia's voice again. He stopped. "I'd like to talk to you," she said. "Not now. When things settle down. Today." He looked at her for a moment. There was nothing hostile in her expression. No condescension, no performance of gratitude either. Just the direct attention of someone who had just watched something happen that she hadn't fully understood and wanted to. "Sure," he said. He left the operations center and walked to the stairwell. He called Sophie at 10:24. She picked up on the second ring, which usually meant she was sitting near her phone, which usually meant she was reading somewhere quiet instead of outside at recess. He'd been meaning to talk to her teacher about that. "Hey, Bug." "Hi, Dad. You sound weird." "I sound normal." "You sound tired." "Little bit." He was sitting on the stairs between the third and fourth floors, back against the wall, tool bag between his knees. "Everything okay at school?" "We had a math test." "How'd it go?" "I think good. There was one problem I wasn't sure about, the one with the fractions and the... It had 2 steps. Which part got you?" "The second step. I did it the way you showed me, but I wasn't sure if you were supposed to flip before you multiply or after." "Before," Ryan said. "Always before." "That's what I did?" "Then you got it right." "Probably." A pause. "Are you eating lunch?" He looked at his watch. It was 10:25 in the morning. "It's not lunchtime yet. You forget." "I don't forget." "Dad, last Tuesday." He had, in fact, forgotten to eat lunch last Tuesday, which Sophie had discovered because she'd tried to call him at noon, and he hadn't answered because he'd been up on the roof dealing with an HVAC compressor. And when he'd called back, she'd made him describe everything he'd eaten that day, and the list had been shorter than she thought it should be. His 8-year-old had instituted a lunch check-in as a result. He'd been complying, mostly, because it was easier than arguing with her about it, and because, truthfully, he found it oddly stabilizing, having someone who kept track of him. "I'll eat lunch," he said. "Promise." "I promise." "Okay." A brief silence. "Did something happen? You really do sound weird." Ryan looked at the concrete wall across from him. Down the stairwell, he could hear the building starting to normalize. Voices in corridors, the elevator dinging on lower floors, the faint sound of someone's shoes on the metal steps above him. "Something happened," he said. "I'll tell you about it tonight." Good weird or bad weird? He thought about that for a moment. The 30 engineers and the blinking red lights and the 9 minutes he'd had to work with and the look on Derek Holt's face when the screens went green. "I'm not sure yet," he said. "Okay." Sophie accepted this in the practical way she accepted most things. "Dad?" "Yeah." "You're going to eat lunch, though." "I'm going to eat lunch." "Good." He could hear her smiling through the phone. "Bye." "Bye, Bug." He hung up and sat there for a moment longer, in the stairwell, with the tool bag between his knees and the sound of the building around him, and thought about Olivia Bennett saying she wanted to talk to him today, and thought about what he would say when she asked him how a maintenance contractor knew how to fix a fintech company's infrastructure faster than 30 engineers. He hadn't told anyone the answer to that question in a long time. He'd gotten pretty good at not being asked. He stood up, shouldered the bag, and started walking down toward sublevel B to write up the coolant reservoir report. There was still work to do. The coolant reservoir took 20 minutes to document and another 12 to find the right form in the contractor portal, which had been updated sometime in the past month without anyone telling the maintenance contractors, and now required a category designation that hadn't existed in the old system. Ryan spent those 12 minutes on hold with the facilities management line before a coordinator named Jenna walked him through the new drop-down menu, apologized for the transition gap, and told him the form had been updated as part of a broader vendor experience improvement initiative. He thanked Jenna and filed the report and thought, Vendor Experience Improvement Initiative. He had worked in a building that processed $400 million a day, had just saved it from a collapse that would have cost significantly more than that, and was now navigating a contractor portal in sublevel B because nobody had told him about a new drop-down menu. This was not a new feeling. This was, in fact, a very familiar feeling. It had been 3 years since he'd held a job title that came with a badge that opened doors above the second floor. 3 years since anyone in a building like this would have asked his opinion before he offered it. 3 years during which he'd worn the same kind of work shirt he was wearing right now, with the same contractor logo, and learned which doors opened for it and which ones didn't. He knew things about invisible lines that most people in buildings like this never had occasion to consider. The line between the 14th floor and sublevel B. The line between a person who was handed coffee and a person who maintained the machine that made it. The line between someone whose name badge indicated an organizational rank and someone whose name badge indicated what they did to infrastructure. Those 3 years had not made him bitter. He'd been careful about that. Or rather, Sophie had been careful on his behalf, in the way that being responsible for another person's whole world tends to make you careful about things you might otherwise have let slide into bitterness. She needed him functional. She needed him present. She needed him to be the version of her father who came home and helped with fractions and made sure there was food in the refrigerator and didn't carry the weight of his own history so visibly that she could feel it pressing down on their apartment. So he'd been careful. And the care had cost something, the way care usually does when you're spending it instead of receiving it. But the expenditure had also given him something he hadn't fully understood until he was standing in that operations center watching 30 engineers fail to see what he saw in 45 seconds. He saw clearly, not just technically. He saw the room clearly. The hierarchy running on performance instead of competence. The confidence that accumulated not from correctness, but from consistent positive feedback in specific environments. The blind spots that came with spending your entire career in rooms where people looked and talked and dressed the way you looked and talked and dressed. He'd been in those rooms once. He knew what they looked like from the inside, too. He filed the coolant reservoir report, put his phone away, and went to fix an electrical junction box on the second floor that had been on his schedule since last week. At 2:15 p.m., he got a text from a number he didn't have saved. "This is Olivia Bennett's assistant. She's available at 3:30 in her office, 16th floor. Badge access has been arranged." Ryan read the text twice. 16th floor. Badge access arranged. He typed back, "I'll be there." He had never been to the 16th floor. He'd worked in the building for 8 months, had crawled through its walls and crouched beneath its floors, and spent significant time in the mechanical darkness of its infrastructure. And he had never been to the 16th floor because nothing in his job had ever required it, and his badge wouldn't have opened the elevator without the arranged access. The elevator opened onto a reception area with high ceilings and materials that were expensive in a quiet way. Not showy, just unmistakably different from every other floor in the building. The way certain places are expensive in the specific style of people who think displays of wealth are slightly vulgar. The receptionist, a young woman with neat handwriting visible on the notepad in front of her, told him Ms. Bennett would be right with him and offered him water, which he accepted. He sat in one of the chairs and held the water glass and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. He hadn't dressed differently for this. He was still in his work shirt. He'd washed his hands before coming up, scrubbed them in the second-floor bathroom, gotten the grease from the junction box out from under his nails. But his pants were still the same pants, and the embroidered Ryan was still on his chest, and maintenance was still below it. He'd considered, for about 30 seconds, whether to go to his locker and get the spare clothes he kept there, and then decided against it. He didn't know exactly why. Partly it was the practical calculation that changing clothes would have meant explaining something he didn't want to explain yet. Changing his appearance for this meeting implied a version of himself that he was not in fact presenting at work yet, and he wasn't sure he'd decided to present it, but partly it was something less strategic. He wanted to sit in Olivia Bennett's office in the same shirt he'd been wearing when he fixed her system, because those things were the same thing. If she was going to talk to him about one, she should have to look at the other. "Mr. Carter?" The receptionist. "She's ready," Chad. Olivia's office was corner-facing, which meant 2 walls of windows and a view that swept from downtown to the water. She was at her desk when he came in, reading something on a screen, and she looked up when he entered and stood and came around the desk without the formal stiffness that sometimes existed in rooms like this. "Thanks for coming up," she said. She indicated the seating area, a couch and 2 chairs arranged around a low table near the windows, more casual than the desk setup. "Can we sit over here?" They sat. She'd poured 2 glasses of water already. He set his on the table. She looked at him with the same careful attention she'd had in the operations center, except now there was no emergency running in the background, no engineers calling to each other across the room, no dashboard full of red lights. It was just a room and 2 people and a lot of unsaid things sitting between them. "How's the system?" Ryan asked. "Stable. The batch job ran clean at 11:15. Marcus ran 2 verification cycles and everything held." She paused. "He wanted me to tell you that." I think it was his way of acknowledging what you did without having to say it directly. I'll take it, Ryan said. She almost smiled. Not quite. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to know that the question is genuine, not a setup for anything. I'm not building to a point. Okay. How do you know what you know? Ryan looked at the glass of water in front of him for a moment. The same way anyone knows anything, he said. I learned it. Where? He was quiet for long enough that she didn't try to fill the silence, which he appreciated. Most people filled silences faster than they needed to. Before I did maintenance work, he said, I did other things. What other things? He looked at the window. The city below had the afternoon light on it, low and gold, the way cities look in the late afternoon when the air is clear. I worked in software infrastructure, he said. Systems architecture. Specifically, I spent about 4 years building and refining transaction processing platforms for financial technology applications. Olivia was very still. The system you're running, Ryan said, the core transaction processing architecture, the routing logic, the priority weighting framework, the load balancer configuration parameters. He paused. I designed the original version of those and at a company called Viridian Systems before they were acquired. Meridian licensed the architecture in the acquisition. Some of it's been updated since then. You've added layers I didn't build, but the foundation is mine. The silence was different now. It had a quality to it. When I saw the routing table this morning, Ryan said, I knew what was wrong because I wrote the system those tables run on. I knew where the failure points would be because I designed the failure boundaries. I knew about the shared library propagation risk because that was a known limitation I flagged in the original documentation. He stopped, looked at her, which apparently nobody currently at this company has read. Ryan. Her voice was quiet. Why are you doing maintenance work? He'd known the question was coming and had been deciding for the past several hours how much he wanted to answer it. He'd been careful with this answer for 3 years. He'd refined the not answering of it into something nearly automatic, a set of deflections so smooth that most people accepted them without noticing they'd been deflected. He looked at Olivia Bennett, who had not laughed at him this morning, who had said, push it, in a voice that trusted something she didn't fully understand yet, and made a decision. My wife got sick, he said, 3.5 years ago. Serious sick. The kind of sick where the treatment costs more than most people make in a decade. He said it without inflection, not because he didn't feel it, but because he'd learned a long time ago that inflection invited responses he didn't know what to do with. I was running my own company at the time, small, but growing. I liquidated it, sold my equity, sold the house, put everything I had into the treatment. Olivia didn't say anything. It bought her 14 months, Ryan said, which was 14 months more than the first prognosis said we'd get. So, he looked at the window again. After that, I had a daughter who was 5 years old, and no company, and no assets, and a specific expertise that's very useful if you want to start over from nothing, which takes time and capital, neither of which I had. He paused. So I did what made sense. I took work that was consistent and reliable and let me be home at the same time every day. And I kept learning, at night mostly, after Sophie went to sleep. You've been rebuilding, Olivia said. I've been getting there, Ryan said. Slowly. She was quiet for a moment, then, this morning, in the operations center, you knew what was wrong before my engineers did. You tried to tell them. I flagged it yesterday, actually, Ryan said. Submitted a maintenance note about an anomalous pattern I'd noticed in the server corridor monitoring output. Said it looked like a routing priority conflict that could compound under load. He kept his voice neutral. The note was closed as outside the scope of maintenance contractor observations. Olivia pressed her lips together. I know, Ryan said. I want to. I know, he said again, not cutting her off, just letting her know she didn't need to complete the sentence. They sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the afternoon light was doing what it does in cities at this hour, catching the edges of buildings and making them briefly golden, the kind of light that makes urban landscapes look more forgiving than they actually are. I'd like to offer you a position, Olivia said. Not a courtesy position, not a symbolic one. I'm talking about a genuine leadership role in our infrastructure division, chief architect level, with equity, with authority over the platform direction, with I appreciate that, Ryan said. But she heard the but before he'd said it. But I need you to understand something first. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. What happened this morning wasn't just about a system failure. I can fix your infrastructure. I'm happy to have a conversation about what that looks like. But the reason your system almost went down wasn't a technical error. The technical error was a symptom. She was watching him. You had 30 engineers in that room, Ryan said. 30 qualified, credentialed, well-paid people who couldn't find a problem in 45 minutes that I found in 45 seconds. Not because they're not smart, because of where they were looking. Because the way you build a room determines which voices get heard in it. And in that room, the voice attached to a maintenance badge doesn't get heard. He paused. I submitted that note yesterday. It was closed, not because someone read it and decided it was wrong, because someone looked at the source and decided it wasn't worth reading. Olivia was very quiet. So if we're going to have a conversation about me working here, Ryan said, I need to know that conversation includes something more than my title changing, because otherwise you've just patched the other leak. She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the city held the golden light for another few minutes and then let it go. Okay, Olivia said. Tell me what that conversation looks like. Ryan picked up the glass of water from the table, took a drink, set it down. It starts with what happened this morning, he said. All of it, including the parts that aren't comfortable. She nodded. Then we figure out what comes next, he said. And for the first time that day, in a room that wasn't on fire, in a chair that didn't have anyone waiting to tell him to leave, Ryan Carter let himself think about what that might actually mean. The meeting with Olivia lasted until almost 5 o'clock. It wasn't the kind of meeting Ryan had expected, mostly because he hadn't fully known what to expect. He'd walked in prepared for something transactional. An offer, a counteroffer, some version of a negotiation that resolved cleanly into either yes or no. What he got instead was a conversation that kept changing direction, not because either of them was being evasive, but because the thing they were actually talking about kept being bigger than the thing they'd started with. Olivia asked questions the way people do when they're genuinely trying to understand something rather than confirm what they already think. She asked about Viridian systems, how he'd ended up there, what the architecture work had actually looked like, what the acquisition process had been. She asked about the years after, the maintenance work, how he'd navigated the transition. She didn't soften the questions or apologize for them, which Ryan appreciated. Softened questions usually meant the person asking them had already decided what kind of answer they could handle. He answered most of it. Not all. There were parts of the 3 years that he kept in their own compartment, not from shame, but from the simple fact that some things don't belong in a first conversation, and he'd learned the difference between sharing context and unloading history onto someone who hadn't asked for it. What he told her was enough. He could see it registering, recalibrating something in the way she looked at him. Not pity, which would have ended the conversation, but the specific reconsideration of a person who has been holding an incomplete picture and is in the process of revising it. The offer she made was serious. Chief Infrastructure Architect, not a new title pasted over his old situation. Actual authority, actual equity, a reporting line that put him in rooms where decisions got made. She was direct about the numbers, which he respected. Some people buried the compensation discussion in language designed to make you feel ungrateful for caring about it. Ryan told her he needed to think about it. She said she'd give him until Friday. He rode the elevator down from the 16th floor at 4:58 p.m., changed out of his work shirt in the locker room in sublevel A, and walked to his car in the contractor parking section on the far side of the building. The afternoon had cooled into early evening, the kind of dry air evening in late October where the city smells faintly of exhaust and something leafy and the sky goes a flat, clean blue before the dark comes in. He sat in the car for a minute before starting it. Chief Infrastructure Architect. He said it quietly, once, just to hear what it sounded like in the air. Then he started the car and went to pick up Sophie from her after-school program. She was sitting on the front steps of the community center with her backpack in her lap and a library book open on top of it when he pulled up. She looked up, saw the car, and put the book away with the particular efficiency of a child who has been waiting and is ready to stop waiting. You're 4 minutes late, she said, getting in. Traffic on Clement. There's always traffic on Clement. Correct. She settled into the seat and pulled her seatbelt across and looked at him with the appraising look she'd been giving him since she was about 6. A slightly sideways assessment, like she was taking inventory. "You look different." "I look exactly the same." "You look like something happened." "Something did happen. I told you that this morning." "You said you'd tell me tonight." She waited. "It's tonight." Ryan pulled out of the parking lot and into the street. He drove for about half a block, found the beginning of it, and then told her the version that was appropriate for an 8-year-old, which was not that different from the full version except for the parts about equity stakes and organizational authority structures, which he simplified into, "The company asked if he wanted a different kind of job there." "What kind of job?" Sophie asked. "A bigger one. More responsibility. Different work than what I've been doing." "Like the computer stuff you do at night?" "Yeah, like that." She thought about this. Outside the window, the neighborhood moved past. A dry cleaner, a taqueria with its neon open sign glowing orange, a laundromat with 2 people sitting in plastic chairs out front. "Did you fix something?" she asked. "What makes you ask that?" "Because that's usually when people offer you things. When you fix something they couldn't fix." Ryan glanced at her sideways. 8 years old. Sometimes he forgot, and then she said something like that, and he remembered. "Yeah," he said. "I fixed something." "Something big. Pretty big." Sophie nodded as if this confirmed a theory she'd already been developing. "Are you going to take the job?" "I don't know yet. I have until Friday." "What don't you know?" He signaled at the intersection, waited for a gap. "It's a big change. I want to make sure it's the right kind of change. Not just a change." Sophie absorbed this. "Mrs. Patterson said change is good." "Mrs. Patterson also gave you a star sticker every time you spelled necessary correctly, so I'm not sure her philosophy of change is fully calibrated to adult situations." "She's still right," Sophie said. "She might be." They drove the rest of the way home mostly in silence, which was the kind of silence they were both comfortable with. Not empty, just not requiring to be filled. That night, after dinner, and the reading before bed routine, and the lights-out negotiation that Sophie always initiated by asking for 5 more minutes, and Ryan always granted because 5 minutes never hurt anything, and she was usually asleep in 3, Ryan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and his notes, and didn't open either of them. He was thinking about a conversation he'd had once, a long time ago, in a different life. It had been with a man named Gordon Chu, who'd been his first real mentor in the industry. A systems engineer of the old school, the kind of person who'd come up in the era when software architecture was still a craft, practiced by people who thought of themselves as builders. Gordon had a specific thing he said about technical systems that Ryan had been turning over in his mind for 3 years without fully knowing why. He'd said, "The way a system fails tells you more about how it was built than any documentation ever will." Ryan hadn't fully understood it at the time. He'd understood the technical meaning, that failure modes are products of architectural decisions, that the shape of a collapse reveals the shape of the thinking that created it. But he was starting to understand the other dimension of it now, the human dimension, the organizational dimension. The way Meridian had failed this morning was not primarily a technical failure. It was a system failure in the broader sense, a failure of how information moved through the organization, of which signals got amplified and which got filtered out, of how the hierarchy of credentials and titles and access badges had created a structure where the person most capable of solving the problem was the last one to be consulted. He'd built plenty of technical systems. He'd never had the authority to build the kind of system Olivia was, apparently, offering to let him help build now. He was not sure he was ready for that. He was also not sure readiness was the right framework. You were rarely ready for things that mattered. He opened his laptop and pulled up the job description Olivia's assistant had sent over. Read it again. Made some notes in the margin of his yellow legal pad. The same kind of pad he'd been using since grad school, because he'd tried digital note-taking multiple times and kept coming back to paper, which Sophie found inexplicably hilarious. He stayed up until midnight, thinking and writing and revising and thinking some more. Then he went to bed and did not sleep particularly well, which was normal for him on nights when something important was unresolved. Wednesday morning. He was back in the building at 7, because his schedule for the week hadn't changed, and he hadn't told anyone it was going to, and because he'd learned a long time ago that you didn't start living in the future before you'd finished what you were currently responsible for. The building felt different when he walked in. Or maybe he felt different in it. Hard to say. The morning passed mostly without incident. He completed the coolant top-off in server corridor C that he'd flagged in Tuesday's report. He repaired a faulty circuit breaker panel on the 11th floor that had been intermittently tripping. He filed 3 maintenance reports through the contractor portal using the correct drop-down menus and did not require assistance from Jenna. At 11:30, he was in the 4th floor electrical room when Marcus Webb found him. He heard the door and turned. Marcus was standing in the entry, still in his blazer despite the warmth of the building's interior spaces, which Ryan had always thought of as the physical equivalent of keeping your guard up. He looked like he hadn't slept well either. "Got a minute?" Marcus said. Ryan set down his multimeter. "Sure." Marcus came in and stood near the electrical panel with his hands in his pockets, which was the body language of a person who had come to say something and was still negotiating with themselves about how to say it. "Yesterday," Marcus said. "In the ops center." Ryan waited. "I should have listened to you earlier in the day, when you came to me." Marcus looked at the panel instead of at Ryan. "And I should have listened to you in the room instead of—" He stopped. "Instead of what I did." Ryan didn't fill the silence this time either. "I'm not asking you to say it's fine," Marcus said. "I know it wasn't fine. I just wanted to say it to your face instead of—" He made a vague gesture that Ryan interpreted as instead of having Olivia pass it along. "I appreciate that," Ryan said. Marcus nodded at the floor. "For what it's worth," Ryan said, "I understand why it happened. Not why it was right, but why it happened." Marcus looked up. "You didn't know me," Ryan said. "You had 30 engineers and a crisis and some guy from maintenance telling you what the problem was. From where you were standing, listening to me was a gamble that didn't have obvious upside. That's a generous read. It's an accurate one," Ryan said. "The problem isn't you specifically. It's the model everyone in that room was running on, including the people above you who built the model." He paused. "You were in a system that filtered out certain kinds of information. You filtered out mine. That's what the system was designed to do." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Olivia talked to you." "Yesterday afternoon." "She told me about—" Marcus stopped again. "About Viridian. About you." He seemed to be working through something. "I looked it up after she told me. The original architecture documentation. The design specifications for the transaction processing framework." He looked at Ryan directly now. "I recognized the methodology. I'd cited one of those design documents in a paper I wrote in grad school. I didn't know the name behind it." Ryan didn't say anything. "You built something that people in this industry have been building on top of for 6 years, Marcus said, "and I almost had you escorted out of the building." "You did have me almost escorted out of the building," Ryan said. A guy put his hand on my shoulder. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. "Yeah." "It's okay, Marcus." "It's not, but—" He exhaled. "I wanted to say it anyway." Ryan picked his multimeter back up, not dismissively, just reclaiming the rhythm of the morning. "For what it's worth. If I take Olivia's offer, I'd want to work with your team, not around them. Everything I know about how this infrastructure was built, I want to transfer. The goal isn't to make yesterday's situation feel worse. It's to build something that doesn't produce another yesterday." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You're taking the offer?" "I haven't decided yet." "What's the hesitation?" Ryan considered whether to answer that honestly and decided he might as well. "I've been rebuilding something for 3 years. The technical skills, that's easy. I kept those sharp. But the other part, the part where you walk into a room and people listen before you say your credentials out loud." He looked at the panel. "I'm not sure I trust it yet. The listening. I don't know how long it lasts when things get hard." Marcus didn't respond immediately. It was a real pause, the kind that meant he was actually thinking about what he'd heard instead of lining up a response. "That's a fair thing to be uncertain about," he said. Ryan looked at him. "I can't guarantee it," Marcus said. "I can tell you that I personally, after yesterday, am not going to be the person in the room who doesn't listen." He paused. But I can't speak for every room. I know. For whatever it's worth. It's worth something, Ryan said. Marcus left a few minutes later. Ryan stood in the electrical room for a moment after the door closed, listening to the building's ambient hum, the HVAC cycling, the distant percussion of elevator mechanisms, the deep bass of server room cooling systems, and thought about what Marcus had said. I can't guarantee it. Honest. He respected honest. Thursday came and went in the ordinary way that Thursdays tend to, which is to say it had its minor irritations and small satisfactions and nothing that added up to anything definitive. Ryan replaced a water-damaged conduit on the 9th floor, attended a contractor safety briefing in sublevel A that was mandatory and not particularly informative, and ate lunch, which he had promised Sophie he would do, and which he therefore did, at a deli 2 blocks from the building where the guy behind the counter knew his order and didn't make conversation about it. He thought about calling his sister in Portland. They talked every few weeks in the slightly formal way that siblings talk when they've been close, and then lived separate lives long enough that the closeness has to be maintained rather than assumed. She'd been through most of the last 3 years with him, at a distance, had offered to come when Claire died, had come for a week and then had to go back, had called regularly in the months afterward with a practical attentiveness that was her way of saying the things she didn't know how to say directly. He didn't call her Thursday. He wasn't ready to describe the situation to someone who would ask the right questions and make him feel the full weight of his answers. He did text her. Something's happening. Good kind. Tell you Sunday. She texted back, That's a terrible tease. Fine. Sunday. He put the phone away and went back to work. That night, he helped Sophie with a school project about ecosystems. She'd chosen freshwater ecosystems, specifically river systems, because she'd read something about how rivers changed course over time and thought that was interesting. They spread the materials across the kitchen table and worked through it together, Ryan mostly asking questions while Sophie explained what she'd read and drew small, earnest diagrams of water cycles and fish migration patterns. Rivers change because of the land, Sophie said, drawing an arrow that curved around a bend. The land pushes them, and then the river pushes back and changes the land. So they both change each other. That's exactly right, Ryan said. She looked up at him. Why do you say it like that? Like what? Like it means something else. He looked at her drawing. The river, the bend, the arrows going both ways. 8 years old, and she drew the feedback loop without knowing what a feedback loop was. It just makes sense, he said. What you said. She looked at him for another second, clearly not entirely satisfied with this answer, then went back to her diagram. He watched her draw and thought, okay. Yeah. Friday morning, Ryan arrived at the building at his usual time, completed his early tasks, and at 9:15 sent Olivia a text through the number her assistant had used. I'll take the position. I want 2 things before I sign anything. First, I want to review the full organizational structure of the infrastructure division and have input on how information flows through it, not just technical decisions. Second, I want the maintenance note I submitted Tuesday to be part of the formal incident record, unedited, with the original submission timestamp. He put the phone in his pocket and went back to work. The reply came 22 minutes later. Both agreed. My assistant will send you paperwork today. Welcome to the team. He read it twice. Put the phone away again. Crouched back down behind the second-floor electrical panel he'd been working on. The building hummed around him, the same as always. The servers, the cooling systems, the infrastructure he'd spent 8 months maintaining from the outside and was about to begin rebuilding from within. He tightened a connector that had been slightly loose, made a note to recheck the adjacent panel before end of day. The work didn't stop being the work just because something else had changed. He'd learned that too. At 3:45 that afternoon, he was wrapping up paperwork in the contractor office in sublevel A when Derek Holt appeared in the doorway. Derek had the look of a man who'd been in an internal argument for several days and had recently lost. He was carrying a coffee cup that was probably mostly empty by now, and he stood in the doorway without coming in, which was the body language of a person who wanted to be able to leave quickly if the conversation went badly. I heard you're joining the team, Derek said. Looks like it, Ryan said. Derek looked at the coffee cup. I owe you an apology. You don't have to yet. I know I don't have to. Derek said it with enough edge that it was clear he'd already had this conversation with himself and wasn't going to be talked out of it. I laughed. In the ops center, when you said what the problem was, I laughed. He stopped. I've been doing this job for 12 years. I should know better than to laugh at an idea before I've heard it. You did look at the screen, Ryan said, when I described what to filter for. You looked. Derek met his eyes. 30 seconds too late. 30 seconds was enough. I know it was enough. That's the problem. He shifted his weight. I've been thinking about what you said to Marcus. About the model everyone was running. I overheard some of it. He paused. You weren't wrong. Ryan didn't say anything. I've been in rooms like that my whole career, Derek said. I know which voices get heard. I know what a person has to look like for their idea to be taken seriously in the first 10 seconds. He looked at the doorframe. I know all of that, and I still... He stopped again. You still filtered, Ryan said. Yeah. Knowing the bias doesn't make you immune to it, Ryan said. That's one of the things that makes it hard to fix. Derek looked at him for a moment. Is it fixable? Ryan thought about Sophie's river diagram. The land and the water pushing each other, both changing. I think so, he said. If you do it on purpose, deliberately, not as a policy, as a habit, every day, in every room. Derek nodded slowly. Not the nod of someone who was satisfied, but the nod of someone who was going to carry something with them. I'll see you on the team, Derek said. See you on the team, Ryan said. Derek left. Ryan finished his paperwork, signed the last form, and filed it in the contractor submission box for the last time. He looked at the box for a second after he let the paper drop. Then he picked up his tool bag, turned off the light, and walked out of sublevel A. The first week as chief infrastructure architect did not feel the way Ryan had imagined it would, mostly because he hadn't let himself imagine it much. Imagining things too specifically before they happened was a habit he'd broken during the years when the gap between what he'd imagined and what actually occurred had been too wide and too painful to keep crossing. What it actually felt like was uncomfortable in ways he hadn't anticipated, and easier in ways he had. The uncomfortable part was the transition itself, the specific friction of moving from one kind of presence in a building to another kind. The people in the contractor office in sublevel A, the ones he'd shared a break room with for 8 months, responded to the news of his new position with a mixture of genuine warmth and something more complicated underneath it. Carlos, who maintained the HVAC systems and had eaten lunch with Ryan probably 60 times, shook his hand and said, "Man, that's incredible," in a tone that was entirely sincere, and then went quiet in a way that suggested he was doing math about the distance that was opening between their respective situations. Ryan had tried to stay in contact with the contractor office, stopped in twice in the first week just to talk, the way he'd always talked. It felt slightly forced both times, not because the people weren't warm, but because the dynamic had shifted in the way that dynamics shift when the organizational chart places people on different levels. He didn't know how to fix that gracefully. He suspected there wasn't a graceful fix, only time. The easier part was the work itself. He'd been afraid, in some background way he hadn't fully admitted, that 3 years of maintenance and night study would leave visible gaps. That when he sat down in an actual engineering environment with actual resources and actual colleagues who knew what they were doing, the distance would show. It didn't. The night studying had done what it was supposed to do. He wasn't rusty. He was different, actually, from the architect he'd been at Viridian. More patient with problems, less interested in elegant solutions for their own sake, more focused on what a system needed to do versus what it was impressive to make it do. Whether that was growth, or just the effect of having spent 3 years closer to the consequences of bad infrastructure design than most architects ever get, he couldn't say. Probably both. His first significant act was to request a full audit of the change management documentation. Not just the incident that had triggered everything, but the entire history of infrastructure modifications over the past 18 months. Olivia approved it without pushback, which he'd been prepared to argue for and didn't have to. The audit took 6 days. Ryan ran it himself with Derek and 2 other engineers, and what it found was not surprising to him. and was quietly devastating to Marcus, who received the final summary in a meeting on Ryan's second week and went through it with the expression of someone reading the record of decisions they couldn't undo. The pattern was consistent across multiple incidents over 18 months. Technical notes submitted through non-standard channels, contractor logs, facilities reports, informal flagging, had been systematically deprioritized in the incident response workflow. Not maliciously. There was no evidence anyone had looked at a note and decided to ignore it because of who submitted it. The filtering happened earlier than that, at the structural level, where the workflow itself determined which inputs reached the engineers who could act on them. Contractor submissions went to a facilities queue. The facilities queue fed into a weekly review cycle. The weekly review cycle was not connected to the real-time incident response system. The maintenance note Ryan had submitted on Monday, the one that had flagged the routing anomaly that caused Tuesday's collapse, had been sitting in the facilities queue, unread by anyone in the infrastructure division, at the exact moment 30 engineers were failing to find the problem it described. Marcus looked at that specific line in the summary for a long time. "How many incidents in this list could have been caught earlier?" he said. 4 confirmed, Ryan said. 2 more probable. Marcus closed the report, opened it again. "We need to change the intake architecture." "Yes," Ryan said, "we do." That was the beginning of a different kind of work. The organizational kind, which Ryan had understood in theory and was now learning in practice, was harder and stranger than the technical kind in ways that his engineering background had not prepared him for. Technical systems had rules. They behaved according to their design. When they didn't, the deviation was usually traceable and correctable. Human systems had rules too, but the rules were partly hidden, partly contested, partly fictional, and people defended them with an intensity that had nothing to do with whether they were working. He had a meeting in his 3rd week with a senior director named Patricia Voss, who oversaw the vendor management division and had been at Meridian for 7 years. The meeting was ostensibly about the contractor integration protocols, the new intake system Ryan was designing to connect field observations with the engineering workflow. Patricia had been polite in scheduling the meeting, polite in the first 10 minutes, and then had said, with the specificity of someone who'd been preparing this, "I want to be direct with you about a concern." Ryan had said, "Please be." The contractor observation pathway you're proposing, the one that escalates field reports to the real-time incident system, creates a significant accountability issue. If a contractor submits an observation that gets escalated and turns out to be incorrect, who owns that error? Ryan looked at her. The same person who owns any incorrect escalation. The engineer who evaluates it and acts on it. But the source of the initial flag changes the source doesn't change the engineer's responsibility to evaluate it, Ryan said. The source is not the point. The point is whether the information is accurate. Accurate information from a contractor should carry the same weight as accurate information from a senior engineer. Patricia held his gaze. The reality is that our clients expect a certain standard of Patricia. Ryan kept his voice even. On October 14th, the contractor who maintained this building's infrastructure submitted a note that correctly identified the configuration anomaly that caused a 40-minute platform outage and came within 8 minutes of a full system collapse. That note never reached the infrastructure division because of the intake architecture we're currently talking about changing. He paused. I'd like to understand the client confidence argument against fixing that. The silence was the kind that happens when a room runs out of procedural cover. Patricia looked at her notepad. I'm not arguing against fixing the intake architecture, she said, more carefully. I'm raising questions about how it's structured. Those are fair questions, Ryan said. Let's work through them. They spent another 40 minutes on it. It wasn't comfortable, but it was honest, and by the end they had a framework that Patricia signed off on. Not enthusiastically, but genuinely. He'd learned, in those first weeks, that genuine was enough. Enthusiastic was a luxury. You built things with genuine. He told Sophie about the job change in the way he told her most things, incrementally, over dinners and car rides, in the natural flow of daily report rather than as a formal announcement. She processed it in pieces, asking questions that were sometimes very specific and sometimes revealed she'd been thinking about something for several days before asking. The specific ones were usually about logistics. Would he have to work later? Would he still be able to pick her up? Was the new parking spot still on the far side of the building? The days-long ones were different. 3 weeks into the new position, on a Thursday night while he was cleaning up after dinner, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with a book she wasn't really reading, she said, "Do people treat you different now?" Ryan set the pan he was drying down on the counter. "What makes you ask that?" "Because of the job." She was looking at the table rather than him.
But
You used to fix things, and now you're in charge of things. Do they treat you different? He thought about Patricia Voss's meeting, Marcus's report, the elevator to the 16th floor that now opened with his own badge. "Some people do," he said. "Is that good?" He came and sat down across from her. "Some of it is, some of it isn't." "What part isn't?" He thought about how to answer this in a way that was true without being too heavy. The part where you wonder whether they treat you differently because of what you can do or because of what it says on your badge now. Sophie looked at him. "Can it be both?" He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "It can be both. That's actually the complicated part." She seemed to accept this. Went back to the book she wasn't really reading for a moment, then looked up again. "You always treated people the same," she said, "before and after." "I try to." "You do," she said, with the simple certainty that children have about the people they know best, the certainty that doesn't come from analysis, but from accumulated observation over every ordinary day. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said, "Finish your reading, bed in 20. She went back to the book. He went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment before picking up the pan again. The crisis came in his 5th week, and it came sideways, the way the worst ones usually do. It started with an email. Not a dramatic one. That was the thing. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, copied to Olivia and Marcus and Ryan and 3 other senior directors, sent by a man named Clifton Marsh, who was the founder and CEO of Archway Capital Partners, which was one of Meridian's 5 largest enterprise clients. The email was 2 paragraphs, professionally courteous in tone, and stated that Archway was conducting a scheduled vendor security review and had identified a number of concerns regarding Meridian's infrastructure stability and data handling protocols that they would like to discuss in a formal meeting at the earliest convenience. Ryan read it twice and felt the hair on the back of his neck do something. He went to Olivia's office. She was already reading it when he walked in. She looked up. "You've seen it," she said. "Just now." He sat down. "What do you know about Archway?" "They've been a client for 4 years. Annual contract value around $18 million. Clifton Marsh is thorough. Runs formal vendor reviews every 18 months. Always has. Last review was 14 months ago. Came back clean." She put her phone down. "But the timing is off. He's not due for another review for 4 months." "What triggered it early?" "That's what I want to know." Ryan thought about the phrase infrastructure stability and data handling protocols. It was specific language. More specific than a routine security review would typically cite in an initial email. "He knows something," Ryan said. Olivia looked at him. "Or someone told him something," Ryan said. "That language isn't generic. Infrastructure stability in the context of a fintech vendor review, post-incident. That's someone telling a client there are things they should be asking about." Olivia was very still in the way she was still when she was processing something she didn't like but was going to deal with directly. "You think someone inside this company contacted Archway?" "I think it's worth understanding how Clifton Marsh came to schedule an early review with that specific language 4 weeks after we had a significant public-facing outage." "The outage was disclosed to clients," Olivia said. "We issued the incident report." "The incident report was accurate and professional and gave clients appropriate context," Ryan said. "But an incident report and someone telling a client, you should ask them harder questions than that, are 2 different things." The silence held for a moment. "Who would do that?" Olivia said. Not defensively. As an actual question, a genuine one, the kind that came from someone trying to understand a situation rather than deflect it. Ryan didn't know the answer to that. There were people in the building who'd been uncomfortable with his appointment. There were people whose authority had shifted when his role was created, whose territory the new intake architecture had redrawn. He didn't think anyone was acting maliciously. He'd seen nothing that looked like malice. But he also knew that people who felt threatened rarely announced it. They found other channels. "I don't know," he said, "but I think the Archway meeting is real regardless of how it was triggered, and we should treat it as an opportunity rather than a threat." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "If Clifton Marsh has specific questions about our infrastructure stability," Ryan said, "then we should answer them, completely and honestly. If our infrastructure is as stable as I've been working to make it, the review should come back clean." What? "If there are gaps we haven't addressed yet, and there are some, I've documented them, we should tell him what they are, what the plan is, and when it will be done." He paused. "The worst thing we can do is go into that meeting trying to manage his perception instead of giving him information." Olivia looked at him for a moment. "You know, most executives would tell me the exact opposite of that." "I know," Ryan said. "Transparency in a vendor review is a negotiating liability. If you disclose known gaps, the client has leverage. If you don't disclose known gaps and they find them anyway, the client has grounds for termination for cause." He met her eyes. "And someone apparently wants Clifton Marsh to find them." She held his gaze. He could see her running the calculation, the same way he'd watched her run it in the operations center 5 weeks ago. Not looking for the comfortable answer, looking for the true one. "Set up the meeting," she said. "I want you in the room. I'll prepare the documentation." "All of it, known gaps included." "All of it," Ryan said. The Archway meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, 10 days out. Ryan spent those 10 days doing the most thorough infrastructure documentation he'd produced since the early Viridian days. Not because he was covering anything, but because the process of documenting a system honestly, with all its rough edges visible, was the only way to actually understand its current state. It was during this documentation process, on day 6, that he found it. He almost missed it. It was buried in the configuration history logs for the client-facing API gateway, not the main transaction processing cluster that had failed in October, but the secondary layer that handled client authentication and data access. A modification entry, time-stamped 3 weeks ago, in a routine-looking update to the session token management protocol. The modification itself wasn't wrong exactly. It was a legitimate-looking change to how session tokens were validated under high-load conditions, the kind of change you might make to improve performance during peak traffic. But when Ryan traced the change backward through the Git commits and cross-referenced it with the access logs, something didn't sit right. The commit had been made from an authorized developer account, but the access pattern around it was unusual. A sequence of queries that tested the boundaries of the token validation logic in a way that systematic performance testing didn't usually look like. It looked more like someone mapping a vulnerability than measuring a load threshold. Ryan sat with this for a long time. He pulled the associated logs, ran a comparison against the baseline traffic patterns for that account, found 4 similar sessions in the preceding 6 weeks, each one probing the same set of parameters from slightly different angles, each one careful enough that it wouldn't have flagged a standard intrusion detection system. Someone who understood the system very well had been looking for something in it. And they'd found something, he thought. He wasn't sure what yet, but the pattern had the shape of reconnaissance that had located a target. He called Olivia at 7 in the evening, when she was presumably still at the office, because she was almost always still at the office at 7 in the evening. She picked up on the second ring. "What's wrong?" "Probably nothing," Ryan said. "I want you to look at something tomorrow morning before I decide how seriously to take it." "How seriously are you currently taking it?" He looked at the screen in front of him. The logs, the 4 sessions, the careful, methodical pattern of someone who was not testing performance. "Seriously enough to call you at 7, he said. "A beat. I'll be in at 7:30. Send me what you have." He sent it. Then he called his sister in Portland, which was unusual for a weekday. She picked up and said, "It's not Sunday." "I know." "You said you'd tell me Sunday." "I'm telling you some of it now," he said. "The rest on Sunday." "This is the good kind something?" "The good kind something turned into a complicated kind something," Ryan said, "which I probably should have expected." "Ryan," her voice was careful in the specific way it got careful when she was making space for him to say more. "Are you okay?" He was in his kitchen. The apartment was quiet. Sophie was asleep. The refrigerator was making its usual noise. Through the window, the city was doing its city things, indifferent and continuous. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay. I found something at work. I don't know what it means yet. I wanted to talk to someone who doesn't work there." "So talk," she said. He talked. Not all of it. Not the technical specifics, which wouldn't mean anything to her, but the shape of it. The logs and the pattern and the archway meeting and the timing and the background feeling that something had been set in motion before he'd arrived in that building, something that his arrival had not stopped, but had possibly accelerated. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he'd always valued about her. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're not going to walk away from it." "No, you never do." "I know. Sophie okay?" "She's great," he said, and the word landed with full weight because it was true. "She told me the other day that I treat people the same before and after." "She's right," his sister said. "She's 8. She's right, and she's 8. Both things are true." A pause. "Call me Sunday. Tell me all of it." "I will." "Ryan." "Yeah. Whatever this turns out to be, you're not doing it alone this time. You know that, right?" He looked at the kitchen window, the city, the ordinary darkness outside. "I'm starting to," he said. Thursday morning. Olivia's office, 7:42. She had the logs open on her screen when he arrived, and she'd clearly been reading them for a while because she had a full coffee cup she hadn't touched and a yellow legal pad. He noticed the yellow legal pad with a slight jolt of recognition, with handwriting on it that she'd been making before he knocked. "Tell me I'm reading this wrong," she said. "Walk me through what you're seeing," Ryan said. He sat down. "The session pattern around the token validation changes. It's not load testing." "No. It's probing." "Yes." She turned in her chair to face him directly. "For what?" "I don't know yet. The token validation logic governs how we authenticate client data access. If someone found a vulnerability in the validation protocol under specific high-load conditions, they could potentially—" He stopped, chose the words carefully. "They could potentially establish an access channel that bypasses standard authentication. Not for normal traffic, only for traffic that meets specific parameters." "A backdoor," Olivia said flatly. "A conditional one, hidden inside what would look like a performance modification." The silence in the office was heavy in a specific way, the weight of a thing that has become real by being named. "Is it active?" she said. "I don't know. I can test for it, but I wanted you to know first, because if it is active, the archway meeting becomes something else entirely," Olivia said. "Yes." She stood up, walked to the window. The city was doing its morning things below: traffic building, a line at the coffee cart on the corner, the ordinary mechanical progress of another workday. "Who has authorization to make changes to the API gateway config?" she said. 9 people currently. 4 of them are on the infrastructure team. 2 are in DevOps. 3 are senior directors with legacy access from before the last security review. "I want the access list. I'll have it to you in an hour." "And Ryan." She turned from the window. Her face was composed, but there was something underneath the composure that he hadn't seen there before. Not fear exactly, more like the specific look of a person who has been running a company for 2 years and has just become aware that something has been running inside it that she didn't know about. The person who contacted Archway. The person who made sure Clifton Marsh would walk into that meeting with the right questions. "Yeah," Ryan said. "You think it's the same person?" He looked at her. He hadn't said it yet because he hadn't wanted to say it until he was more sure, but she'd gotten there herself, which meant it was the obvious read, and he wasn't wrong to have it. "I think someone has been working toward a specific outcome," Ryan said. "I think the Archway review is part of it. I think the access logs are part of it. I think October 14th... He stopped. "Say it," Olivia said. "I think the October 14th outage may not have been purely accidental." The silence after that was the longest one yet. Outside, the morning continued. The coffee cart line moved. A truck turned at the intersection. The city, Indifferent and continuous and uninvolved, went about its business. Olivia sat back down at her desk. She put both hands flat on the surface, the way Marcus had in the operations center 5 weeks ago, and looked at the screen. "Then we need to know who," she said. "Yes," Ryan said. "Before Thursday." "Yes." She looked at him. "Can you do that?" He thought about the logs, the 4 sessions, the careful, methodical pattern of someone who knew the system well enough to hide inside it, someone who had been in these rooms long before he had. "I can try," he said. "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "I can do it." She nodded, picked up her phone. Ryan stood up, went back to his office, and started pulling logs. The logs did not give up their secrets easily. Ryan spent the first day pulling access records across every system that touched the API gateway configuration, the GET repository, the deployment pipeline, the session authentication manager, the change approval workflow. He built a timeline on paper first, because he thought better on paper, and the timeline spread across 3 sheets of yellow legal pad before he had something that felt complete enough to trust. What he was looking for was not a single moment of wrongdoing. That would have been too simple, and whoever had done this was not simple. What he was looking for was a pattern, the cumulative shape of a series of decisions that each looked unremarkable in isolation but assembled into something deliberate when you put them in sequence. He found it on the second day. The account that had made the API gateway modifications belonged to a senior developer named Nathan Fisk, who had been with Meridian for 4 years and held one of the 9 authorized access credentials for the gateway configuration. Nathan was 35, technically competent in the assessments Ryan had reviewed, and had been notably quiet during the transition period following Ryan's appointment. Not hostile, just present in meetings in the minimal way that people are present when they've decided not to engage. Ryan had noticed it and filed it without attaching significance. People adjusted to change at different speeds. Quiet wasn't evidence of anything, but Nathan's account had been used for all 4 probing sessions, and when Ryan cross-referenced the session timestamps against the building access logs, the physical ones, the entry and exit records that facilities management kept, something jarred loose. During 2 of the 4 sessions, Nathan Fisk's access card had not been used to enter the building. His account had been active in the system, his credentials had authenticated, but the physical access record showed him as not present. Ryan sat with that for a while. 2 possibilities. Either Nathan had remote access capabilities that weren't logged in the standard system. Possible, some senior developers had VPN configurations that predated the last security audit, or someone else had used Nathan's credentials. Ryan went back through the VPN access logs and found the remote sessions. They existed. They were legitimate. Nathan had been working from home on both days in question, according to his own calendar entries. So Nathan's credentials had been used, Nathan had been present remotely. But the session pattern didn't match Nathan's normal working behavior at all. His legitimate remote sessions showed consistent, purposeful work. Commits, deployments, code reviews, the sequential pattern of someone working through a task list. The 4 probing sessions showed something different, shorter bursts, narrower focus. The same parameters tested from slightly different angles, as if someone was trying to find the edge of something. 2 people using the same account in overlapping windows, or a single person whose behavior was dramatically inconsistent across contexts. Ryan pulled Nathan's complete session history for the past 6 months and compared the behavioral signature across all of it, the typing cadence metrics that the security system recorded, the navigation patterns, the time of session distributions. He ran the comparison manually, which took 4 hours because he didn't want to use any automated tool that would leave a record in the system before he understood what he was looking at. The 4 anomalous sessions were behavioral outliers. Not Nathan. Someone had Nathan's credentials. Ryan called Olivia at 6:15 on the second day. "It's not Nathan," he said. "You're sure?" "Behaviorally, yes. The sessions that concern me don't match his pattern. Someone else was using his account." "How?" "I don't know yet. Credential sharing, theft, a keylogger, social engineering, any of those are possible. I need to talk to Nathan." A pause on Olivia's end. "Does he know he's been compromised?" "I don't know what he knows, which is why I need to talk to him before this goes wider." How do you want to handle it? Ryan thought about this. Nathan Fisk was either an innocent victim whose credentials had been stolen and used without his knowledge, or he was someone who had deliberately facilitated access and was now hoping the trail pointed cleanly at someone else. The conversation needed to accommodate both possibilities without tipping off the second one if it was true. Informally, Ryan said. I'll come to him as a colleague doing a security review. No implication, no accusation. I just want to see how he reacts to the questions. Okay? Olivia's voice was careful. Ryan, if this is what you think it is, we need to bring in our legal team before Thursday. I know, I want one more day. You have until tomorrow evening. He found Nathan in the third-floor development bullpen the next morning, which was where Nathan typically worked, at the second desk from the window with 2 monitors and a collection of mechanical keyboards that had been a minor topic of discussion among his colleagues. Ryan came to him directly, no preamble, because preamble made people more guarded than directness did. Got a few minutes? Ryan said. Nathan looked up. He had the face of a person who had been expecting something and was not sure this was it. Sure. Ryan sat in the empty chair at the adjacent desk. I'm doing a baseline security review on the API Gateway access accounts. Routine, part of the infrastructure audit I've been running. I want to walk through your account's recent session activity and make sure everything looks right from your end. Nathan's expression was neutral, watchful. Okay. Were you doing any load testing work on the token validation protocol in the last 6 weeks? There are some sessions in your account history that look different from your usual pattern. A pause that lasted slightly too long. Load testing. Yeah, I was doing some informal benchmarking. Nothing that went into a formal change request. On these dates, Ryan named 2 of the 4 dates from the anomalous sessions. Nathan looked at his desk. I'd have to check my logs. Those were days you were working remotely. Right. He was looking at his desk rather than Ryan. I do most of my testing work from home. Quieter. Makes sense. Ryan kept his voice conversational, easy. The session patterns on those days look a little different from your usual remote work. Shorter bursts, same parameters tested repeatedly, more like mapping than testing. The word mapping landed, and Ryan watched Nathan's jaw do something small and tense. It was exploratory work, Nathan said, seeing where the boundaries of the validation logic were. For what purpose? Nathan looked up. Performance optimization, same as any architecture review. Did you write up the results anywhere? Not formally. It was preliminary. Ryan nodded slowly, not pressing, just receiving, giving Nathan space to decide what he was going to do with the space. Nathan, Ryan said, keeping his voice level, I've been doing this work for a long time. I know what performance benchmarking looks like in the logs, and I know what something else looks like. I'm not here to create a problem for you, but I need to understand what happened in those sessions, and I need to understand it before Thursday morning. Nathan was very still. If your credentials were compromised, Ryan said, that's a situation we can help you with. It happens. It's recoverable. But I need to know. The development bullpen was active around them. Keyboards, low conversations, the ambient sound of people working. Nathan looked at his monitors, looked at his hands, looked at Ryan. I need to talk to someone first, Nathan said. Who? Nathan didn't answer immediately. The pause was longer than it should have been, and the direction of his eyes, briefly up and to the left, the involuntary glance of a person thinking about a specific physical location in the building, told Ryan something. Is there someone in this building who asked you to do this? Ryan said quietly. Nathan's face did something complicated. I'm not, he started, stopped. I'm not trying to damage anything. I want you to know that. Okay? I was told it was a security research exercise, internal, that it was authorized. Ryan held very still. Who told you that? Another pause. Nathan's hands were flat on the desk now, and Ryan could see the deliberation happening in real time, the specific calculation of someone who has understood, perhaps for the first time at full resolution, that the situation they're in is larger and more serious than the one they agreed to enter. Thomas Reeve, Nathan said. Ryan knew the name. Thomas Reeve was one of the 3 senior directors with Legacy API Gateway Access. He'd been at Meridian for 6 years, longer than Olivia's tenure, longer than Marcus's, and held the title of Chief Strategy Officer, which put him in every significant business decision meeting and gave him a comprehensive view of the company's technical infrastructure and client relationships. He had been consistently pleasant to Ryan during the transition, supportive in meetings, complimentary about the intake architecture changes in a way that had felt genuine. Thomas told you this was an authorized internal exercise, Ryan said. He said it was for a security report he was preparing, that he needed someone to document potential vulnerabilities in the validation layer before he could formally propose a security upgrade. Nathan's voice was tight. He said it needed to be done quietly because he said the infrastructure team had been resistant to security review recommendations. Ryan absorbed this. When did he approach you? About 2 months ago, before October, before the outage. Ryan filed that and stayed on Nathan's face. Did he give you any documentation of the authorization? An email, an internal request, anything in the system? He said the communication needed to stay out of the formal channels, for the same reason. Resistance from the team. Ryan nodded slowly. There it was. The clean, recognizable shape of a manipulation that worked because it was designed specifically for the person it was aimed at. A developer who had legitimate concerns about security review resistance, being asked to do something that felt like it served a legitimate purpose. Through channels that were informal but not flagrantly wrong, with a plausible authority figure framing it. Not a crude operation, a careful one. Nathan, Ryan said, I need you to write down everything Thomas told you. Everything you did, every date, every instruction. Do it today, in a personal document outside the company system. Don't talk to anyone here about it, including Thomas. Can you do that? Nathan looked at him. Am I in trouble? Ryan thought about what to say. The honest answer was, possibly, but probably not the kind of trouble that ends careers, because Nathan was clearly a tool rather than the hand holding it, and the law tends to care about the hand. But he wasn't going to make promises he couldn't keep. I think you made a mistake based on information that was given to you deliberately to make that mistake likely, Ryan said. That matters. But I can't tell you how it resolves. That's above what I control. He met Nathan's eyes. What I can tell you is that cooperating fully and immediately is your best available option right now. Nathan nodded. He looked like a man who had been carrying something he didn't fully understand for 2 months and was only now feeling its full weight. Write it down, Ryan said. Today. He went to Olivia at 11:30 with everything he had. She read through it at her desk while he sat across from her, and she read it the way she read everything. Without expression, without rushing, with the stillness of a person who has learned that reacting to information before you've finished receiving it is a form of inaccuracy. When she finished, she set the papers down. Thomas, she said. Yes. He's been here 6 years. He was on the hiring committee when I was brought in as CEO. I know. She was quiet for a moment. What's the play? He used Nathan's credentials to probe a vulnerability in the API gateway authentication layer. Based on the session pattern, he found one. The Archway meeting Thursday is almost certainly designed to surface that vulnerability in a context that maximizes damage to the company's client relationships. Ryan paused. But the full picture is worse than that. Olivia looked at him. The October outage, Ryan said. I've been tracing backward from the gateway probe sessions. There's a similar behavioral anomaly in the change management logs from late September, 3 weeks before the outage. A series of low-level modifications to the upgrade scheduling system that look routine but have the same signature. Someone with deep system access made changes that increase the probability of a cascade failure during the October upgrade window. Someone engineered the outage, Olivia said. I can't prove it to a legal standard yet, but the pattern is consistent. He kept his voice flat because the situation required flatness. Thomas Reeve has been with this company long enough to understand its client relationships, its contracts, and its vulnerabilities better than almost anyone. An engineered outage damages client confidence. A follow-up security breach discovered during a formal vendor review would be catastrophic. If you lose Archway, you probably lose 2 or 3 other major clients in the same review cycle. And a company in that condition is worth significantly less than one that isn't, Olivia said. Yes? She leaned back. Who benefits from Meridian being devalued? Someone who wants to acquire it at a distressed price, or someone who benefits from a competitor's position in the market, or someone whose own interests are served by demonstrating that the current leadership can't protect the platform? Ryan paused. I don't know which. I need more access to find out. Olivia's jaw was set in the way it set when she was making a decision she didn't like but was going to make cleanly. I'm calling legal, she said, and I'm calling our security firm tonight. Before you do, Ryan said. Ryan, before you do, I want to patch the vulnerability. Tonight, before the Archway meeting. If Thomas is planning to demonstrate it in the meeting, or have someone else demonstrate it, we remove the option. He looked at her. He doesn't know I found it. He's expecting to walk into Thursday with a loaded gun. I want to unload it before he gets there. Olivia considered this for exactly as long as it deserved. Can you patch it without tipping him off that you found it? If I structure the change correctly, it looks like a routine validation update, part of the audit documentation we're already preparing for Archway. He'd have no reason to look at it specifically. Do it, she said. Then I make the calls. But Ryan was in the office until past midnight. He patched the vulnerability carefully, not just closing the specific access channel that the probing sessions had identified, but hardening the surrounding logic so that the class of vulnerability couldn't be recreated through similar manipulation. He structured the change documentation the way he'd told Olivia he would, as a routine validation update in the audit package, with commit notes that were accurate but not specific enough to signal that he'd identified a targeted exploit. He reviewed it 3 times before he pushed it. Then he sat back and looked at the screen for a moment. Somewhere in this building, Thomas Reeve was presumably not losing sleep over Thursday, because as far as he knew, the vulnerability was still there, the Archway meeting was still loaded, and the chain of events he'd set in motion 2 months ago was still running on its intended track. Ryan thought about that for a moment. The deliberateness of it, the patience. Someone willing to spend months setting a trap, willing to use a colleague as an unwitting instrument, willing to damage 42,000 clients' access to their own financial operations as part of a plan whose end goal Ryan still didn't fully understand. He was angry about it, actually. He'd been keeping the anger in its compartment all day because the work had required something cooler than anger, but sitting alone in his office at 12:30 in the morning with the patch deployed and the immediate crisis contained, he let himself feel it for a minute. Not the performative kind of anger that wanted to confront someone dramatically. Just the clean, solid kind that comes from watching someone treat other people as instruments and resources, from watching careful malice operate inside something that other people had built and trusted and depended on. He thought about Nathan Fisk, who had tried to do something he thought was legitimate and had been used. Thought about Marcus, who had spent a week under the weight of an incident report that was possibly not just a technical failure. Thought about the 42,000 businesses that had lost access to their financial operations for 40 minutes on a Tuesday morning because someone had decided their disruption was an acceptable cost. He turned off his monitor and packed up. Thomas Reeve's office was on the 14th floor, close enough to the operations center that he would have heard the alarms on October 14th from his desk. Ryan thought about that walking to his car. He drove home through a city that was doing its late-night things. The clusters of light at intersections, the occasional bus running its route through nearly empty streets, the specific quiet of a city between its late crowd and its early one. He thought about Thursday. The legal team was being briefed. The security firm was being brought in. There were going to be conversations that Ryan would not be present for, decisions above his level, processes that would move at the speed of institutional machinery rather than the speed of someone pulling logs in an empty office at midnight. He couldn't control that. He could control the vulnerability, which was closed. He could control the documentation, which was complete. He could control what he walked into the Archway meeting knowing, which was everything. He pulled into his parking space, sat in the car for a moment. His phone showed a text from Sophie, time-stamped 9:47 p.m., which was significantly past her bedtime. "Did you eat dinner?" He smiled despite everything. He texted back, "Yes. Go to sleep." Her response came immediately, which meant she'd been waiting. "It's almost 1 a.m., Dad." "I know. I'm home now," Sleep. Okay, don't forget tomorrow is picture day. I need my blue shirt. I know, it's clean. Sleep. Okay, good night. Good night, Bug. He got out of the car and went inside, checked the hallway to her room out of habit, saw the thin line of darkness under her door that meant the light was off. Found the blue shirt in the clean laundry pile on the couch and hung it on her door handle so it would be there in the morning. Then he sat at the kitchen table and made himself eat something. Crackers, peanut butter, a glass of water. Because he'd told Sophie he'd eat dinner, and he was going to hold to that even at 1 in the morning after a day that had started with log analysis and ended with patching a corporate sabotage vulnerability. The blue shirt hung on the door handle. Picture day. The ordinary things didn't pause for the complicated ones. He'd learned that, and he'd learned to be grateful for it rather than frustrated. The picture day and the fractions and the lunch check-in and the 5 more minutes at bedtime, they were not interruptions to the serious business of his life. They were the reason the serious business was worth doing. He finished the crackers, rinsed the glass, and went to bed. Thursday morning arrived with the specific flatness of a day that knows it has a lot to carry. Ryan was at the office by 7:15. Olivia was already there. The legal team representative, a compact, precise woman named Sandra Chu, who had flown in from the firm's main office the previous evening, was set up in a conference room with 2 associates and a considerable amount of printed documentation. The security firm's lead analyst, a man named Garrett, who communicated primarily through clipped declarative sentences, had been on site since 6. Thomas Reeve arrived at his usual time, 8:15, with a coffee from the cart on the corner. Ryan watched him come through the lobby on the internal camera feed from his own office, and watched him stop to talk to someone near the elevators, and watched the easy, familiar posture of a man who believed he was in control of the day that was arriving. Ryan turned away from the camera feed and reviewed his documentation for the Archway meeting one more time. The meeting was at 10. At 9:40, Sandra Chu knocked on his open door. The board has been briefed. Olivia's authorized us to proceed with a formal request to Thomas Reeve to appear for questioning at 2 this afternoon. She paused. We're not disclosing the basis until the meeting. He'll know something is happening, but not the specifics. Does he know about the Archway meeting? He's not on the attendee list. He was never on it. Olivia kept the list tight. Okay. Sandra looked at him for a moment. You did clean work on this, she said. It was a lawyer's compliment. Functional, not decorative. I just pulled the logs, Ryan said. You pulled the right logs in the right sequence before anyone else knew they needed to be pulled. She picked up her files. That's not nothing. She left. Ryan straightened his documentation, put on the jacket he'd hung on the back of his chair, and went to meet the day. The Archway meeting had 6 people on Meridian's side. Olivia, Ryan, Marcus, Sandra, and 2 technical leads. Clifton Marsh brought 3 people, his CTO, a security consultant, and his general counsel, which told you everything about what kind of meeting he thought he was walking into. Clifton Marsh was 61, with the particular physicality of a man who had been in boardrooms for 30 years and had stopped needing to perform authority because he simply had it. He shook hands, sat down, and put his hands flat on the table in a way that reminded Ryan, briefly, of Marcus in the operations center 7 weeks ago. I appreciate you making time on short notice, Clifton said. Of course, Olivia said. Before we go into your agenda, I want to share some documentation with you. I think it will change the shape of the conversation. Clifton looked at her. His security consultant shifted slightly. All right. Olivia nodded to Ryan. Ryan distributed the packets, printed, clean, indexed. The incident analysis, the audit findings, the vulnerability identification and patch documentation, the timeline of the infrastructure remediation work, the new intake architecture, the change management improvements, all of it, complete and honest, including the gaps they hadn't finished closing yet, and the timeline for closing them. The last document in the packet was the log analysis, behavioral anomalies, the probing sessions, the cascade failure precursor modifications. Clifton Marsh opened the packet and read. His CTO read. His security consultant read faster and looked up at Ryan with the expression of a technical professional recognizing another technical professional's work. The room was very quiet for several minutes. Clifton turned to the log analysis section. He read it carefully, looked up at Olivia. This is a deliberate internal attack. We believe so, Olivia said. We're in the process of determining the full scope and the parties responsible. The vulnerability identified in this analysis was patched Tuesday night. Your data was not accessed. You're certain? I'm certain, Ryan said. The probing sessions identified the vulnerability but never exploited it. They were reconnaissance. The patch closed the channel before it could be used. Clifton looked at him. He'd been introduced as Chief Infrastructure Architect, and Clifton had the practiced neutrality of a man who reserved judgment on people until he'd seen them in action. He was seeing Ryan in action now. Walk me through the patch. How do you know the channel wasn't used in a window you don't have visibility into? It was a good question. Ryan answered it directly, completely, with the specific technical detail that Clifton's own security consultant would be able to verify independently. He answered the 3 follow-up questions the same way. Clifton's security consultant looked at his notes and then at Clifton and gave a small nod. Clifton sat back. He looked at Olivia. You came into this meeting prepared to show me an attack on your own infrastructure. Yes, Olivia said. Most companies don't do that. Most companies aren't trying to build a relationship based on something other than managed disclosure. She kept her eyes level with his. You had legitimate reasons to ask harder questions about our stability. We wanted to show you what the inside of the answer actually looks like, not the polished version, the real one. That includes the parts that aren't finished yet. Clifton was quiet for a moment. The person responsible for identifying all of this, he said, is sitting at this table. He is, Olivia said. Clifton looked at Ryan again. Something was working in his expression, not just technical evaluation, something broader. How long have you been in this role? 5 weeks, Ryan said. Clifton was quiet for a moment longer. Then he turned back to his team and had a brief, low-voiced exchange with his CTO and his counsel. Ryan couldn't hear the words, but the body language of the exchange had the particular tone of a conversation that is revising its starting premise. Clifton turned back. I want to continue this relationship, he said, with some conditions. Tell me, Olivia said. They spent the next 90 minutes in the genuine version of the meeting Clifton had come prepared to have. Questions and answers, documentation reviewed, security protocols examined, remediation timelines discussed. It was not comfortable all the way through. Some of Clifton's questions landed hard, and some of Olivia's answers acknowledged failures directly, without softening. Ryan answered every technical question he was asked and declined to speculate on the ones he didn't yet have complete answers to, which Clifton's security consultant clearly appreciated. At the end, Clifton said, I'm going to recommend to my board that we maintain the contract, with a formal security review in 90 days. Fair, Olivia said. That review will be comprehensive. Good, Ryan said. Clifton looked at him again. The expression had settled into something more defined. You're going to be the person who runs that review from your side. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, Ryan said. Clifton picked up his packet, tapped it into alignment, and stood. He shook hands with Olivia, then with Ryan, and held Ryan's hand a half-second longer than the others. You did honest work here, he said quietly. We tried to, Ryan said. Clifton left with his team. The room exhaled. Marcus was looking at the table. Sandra was already making notes. Olivia was looking at the window, at the city outside, with the expression of someone who has cleared a thing that had been in front of them and is still catching their breath. Ryan gathered his documents. Ryan, Olivia said. He looked up. Thank you, she said. The same 2 words she'd said in the operations center 7 weeks ago, but they landed differently now. Heavier, more complete, carrying more of what they meant. He nodded. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Thomas Reeve was called into a conference room on the 14th floor, where Sandra Chu and Garrett from the security firm were waiting for him with a considerable amount of printed documentation. Ryan was not in that room. He was at his desk, finishing the 90-day security review framework that Clifton Marsh had asked for, because that was the work that needed doing next, and the work didn't pause for the resolution of the things that had made it necessary. His phone buzzed at 4:17. Sophie. Can we have pancakes for dinner? He looked at the screen and felt the day settle slightly around him, the way it always did when ordinary things arrived at the right moment. "Yes," he typed back. "I'll be home by 6. Thomas Reeve resigned on a Friday. It wasn't announced that way. Officially, the company communication that went out to senior staff described it as a mutual separation following a strategic realignment, which was the corporate language for something that everyone in the building understood was not voluntary and not amicable. Sandra Chu's firm had spent 8 days in depositions and document reviews before arriving at an agreement that kept the matter out of litigation in exchange for a full cooperation statement, a signed non-disclosure, and Thomas walking out of the building with a box and without a reference. Ryan heard about the resignation from Marcus, who stopped by his office on a Friday afternoon with the particular expression of someone delivering news they haven't fully processed themselves. "He's gone," Marcus said. "I know," Ryan said. He'd known it was coming since Sandra's team had completed the cooperation agreement 2 days earlier. Marcus sat down in the chair across from Ryan's desk. The first time he'd sat in that chair rather than standing near the door, which was a small thing, and not a small thing. "The board is calling it a security breach. Internally, the story is that Thomas was running a long-term scheme to destabilize the company for an acquisition play. Apparently he had a consulting relationship with a competitor firm that we didn't know about. Ryan had known that part too. The full picture had come out during Sandra's process. Thomas had been in a paid advisory arrangement with Vantage Group, a rival fintech company that had been attempting to position itself for a distressed acquisition of Meridian. The engineered October outage, the API vulnerability, the archway setup. They were all pieces of a devaluation strategy designed to make Meridian look like a company whose infrastructure couldn't be trusted at the exact moment Vantage would have been positioned to make a below-market acquisition offer. It had been patient, careful, and very nearly successful. "Did you know any of this when you were pulling the logs?" Marcus asked. "Not the acquisition angle," Ryan said. "I knew someone with deep system access was working toward a specific outcome. I didn't know the business reason behind it until Sandra's team found the Vantage connection." Marcus was quiet for a moment. 6 years, he said. He'd been here 6 years. I worked with him on 3 major platform launches. He sat in our strategy meetings. He shook his head slowly. "I thought I could read people." "You can read people," Ryan said. "Thomas was reading people too. He knew exactly how to present himself to stay beneath the threshold that triggers suspicion. That's not a failure of your judgment. That's a skilled manipulation." "That's generous." "It's accurate," Ryan said. "There's a difference." Marcus looked at the window. "Nathan?" Sandra's team recommended against any formal action. He cooperated fully, and everything points to him being a genuine victim of the framing. Ryan paused. "He's also been moved to a different team. His choice. He asked for the transfer. I think he needed the distance." "Can't blame him." "No." They sat for a moment in the kind of quiet that 2 people sit in when they've been through something together that they didn't choose to go through and are still deciding what to make of it. "The 90-day archway review," Marcus said. "You need support staff for that?" "I was going to ask you about Derek," Ryan said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Derek?" "He knows the system deeply. He's got good instincts when he's not running on autopilot. And he's been different since October. I think he'd do good work on it." Marcus considered this. "I'll talk to him." "Tell him I asked specifically," Ryan said. "Don't make it an assignment. I want it to be a choice." Marcus nodded. He stood and then paused at the door. "Ryan." Ryan looked up. "I know I said this before, but I want to say it again now that all of this is—" Marcus made a gesture that encompassed the past 7 weeks and everything in them. "You didn't have to handle any of this the way you did. You could have covered yourself at every turn and you didn't. You came to me directly. You came to Olivia directly. You prepared documentation that exposed problems you could have minimized." He paused. "A lot of people in your position would have used this situation to make themselves look as good as possible. You just tried to fix it." Ryan thought about that for a moment. "The situation wasn't about me," he said. "I know. That's what I'm saying." After Marcus left, Ryan sat with that for a while. The office was quiet. Outside his window, the building's ambient hum continued. Servers, cooling systems, the infrastructure doing what it was built to do. unaware of, and indifferent to the human complexity running alongside it. He thought about Thomas Reeves sitting in a conference room with Sandra Chu's associates, deciding which parts of the story to give up and in what order, doing the calculations of a person who had built a careful plan and watched it come apart at a specific seam. Ryan found he didn't have much to say about Thomas, internally. Not forgiveness, because nothing Thomas had done was directed at Ryan personally, and therefore forgiveness wasn't really the relevant frame. Not contempt either. Contempt required a kind of sustained emotional investment he didn't have available. What he felt mostly was that Thomas had misunderstood something fundamental. He'd looked at Meridian and seen a system: assets, client relationships, infrastructure value, acquisition price. He'd been correct about all of those things and had completely missed the part that wasn't on a balance sheet, the part that was just people doing work they cared about. Ryan turned back to his screen and kept building the 90-day review framework. Olivia called a company-wide meeting for the following Thursday. All hands, mandatory. The kind that got scheduled when something has happened that leadership has decided to address directly rather than manage through middle channels. The announcement went out on Monday. By Tuesday morning, the hallway conversations had the particular quality of people trying to figure out what they were walking into. Informed guessing, partial information assembled into competing theories. Ryan heard two different versions of the Thomas Reeves story from two different sources who had clearly been in different conversations, and neither version was fully accurate, which was normal for organizational rumor and didn't particularly concern him. What concerned him slightly was what Olivia had told him on Monday afternoon. She'd asked him to speak at the meeting. He'd been quiet for long enough that she'd added, "Not a performance, not a polished presentation, just what you'd say if you had a room full of people and the right context to say it in." "What context do you want me to provide?" "The real one," Olivia said. "October 14th. Who you were, what happened, what it means. I'm going to say some things first, things the company needs to hear from me directly. But the part about what it costs when a building full of people don't see someone who's standing right in front of them," she paused. "That part should come from you." Ryan thought about standing in front of hundreds of people who had spent 8 months walking past him in the hallways, who had handed him access requests and maintenance forms, and occasionally asked him to check on a rattling noise in the ceiling. He thought about the gap between that version of him and the version now sitting in an office on the 9th floor with Chief Infrastructure Architect on his badge. He thought about what he actually had to say about that gap. Not the inspirational version. He'd never been comfortable with the inspirational version of anything. The true version. "Okay," he said. "Thursday, 10 o'clock. "What are you going to say?" he asked. "Before me." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "The truth," she said. "All of it. What happened in October, what we found after, what it cost, what we're changing, and what I personally missed for 8 months." She paused again. "I walked past you in this building, Ryan. For 8 months I walked past you and didn't see you. I'm going to say that in front of everyone." He didn't have a response to that felt adequate, so he just said, "I'll be there." He told Sophie on Tuesday night during dinner because she deserved to know in advance rather than hearing about it afterward. She was eating her rice with the focused inefficiency that characterized her approach to foods she found only acceptable rather than good. And she looked up when he told her and went still in the way. She went still when she was about to say something that mattered. "Can I come?" she said. He hadn't considered that. "It's a work meeting, Bug. During school." "Half-day Wednesday," she said immediately. "We have teacher development Thursday morning. I don't have to be there until noon." He looked at her. She was holding her fork and looking at him with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific question to become askable and is not going to let the window close. "Why do you want to come?" he asked. She put the fork down. "Because I want to see," she said. "I've been hearing about this building for 8 months, and I want—" She stopped, started again. "You always do things and nobody sees. I want to see." He didn't say anything for a moment. "I'll think about it," he said. "Dad?" "I said I'll think about it." She picked the fork back up, but she was watching him from under her eyelashes in the way she did when she'd said the important thing and was waiting for it to land. He thought about it for the rest of Tuesday night and decided before he went to sleep. He called Olivia at 7:15 Wednesday morning. "My daughter wants to come Thursday. 8 years old, she'd be quiet and she'd... Bring her, Olivia said. No hesitation. It might be, bring her, Ryan. He texted Sophie at 7:17. You can come. You have to sit still and not interrupt. She texted back a series of what appeared to be celebratory punctuation marks that he interpreted as agreement. Wednesday passed in the ordinary way of the day before something that isn't ordinary. Ryan finished the review framework, met with Garrett from the security firm to go over the authentication hardening documentation, and ate lunch, because Sophie would ask and he had promised. He called his sister in the evening and told her the rest of the story he'd been promising since the week before. She listened through all of it without interrupting, which took a while. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "You're going to speak in front of the whole company." "Apparently." "How do you feel about that?" "Like I'd rather be behind a server rack," he said. She laughed, and it was the genuine laugh he'd been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it. "You'll be fine," she said. "You don't know that." "I know you," she said. "Same thing." He went to bed at a reasonable hour and lay awake for 45 minutes, thinking about what he was going to say, and then stopped thinking about it. Because the thing he'd learned about saying difficult, true things in rooms full of people was that you couldn't prepare the emotion. You could only prepare the honesty. Thursday morning. Sophie ate breakfast faster than usual, which she would deny if accused of it. She wore a dark blue sweater that she'd selected herself, which Ryan had noticed was her version of dressing for something important. He drove them to the building and found a visitor badge waiting at reception, already printed with Sophie Carter on it, which she accepted with the solemnity of someone receiving a credential they'd been working toward. She looked at the lobby, the high ceiling, the security barriers, the movement of people in professional clothes carrying professional things, and then looked at Ryan. "This is where you fix the computers," she said. "In a manner of speaking," he said. "It's nicer than I thought. The contractor parking is less nice." "Dad," she said. "What?" "I'm just saying it's nice. He signed her in and they took the elevator to the floor where the all hands was being held. The largest conference space in the building, a room that had been set up with rows of chairs and a low stage at the front where a podium stood and a screen behind it showed the Meridian logo in quiet rotation. The room was filling up. Ryan took 2 seats near the aisle, not at the front, not at the back. Sophie sat next to him with her visitor badge clipped to her sweater and watched the room with the attentive openness that children have when they're somewhere new, cataloging it without judgment. Marcus found them before the meeting started, stopped next to Ryan's chair, and looked at Sophie with the slightly uncertain expression that adults produce when they haven't spent much time around children and aren't sure what register to use. "You must be Sophie," he said. "I know who you are," Sophie said. "You're Marcus. You said sorry to my dad." Marcus blinked, looked at Ryan. Ryan kept his expression neutral. Yes, Marcus said. "I did." "Good," Sophie said, and went back to watching the room. Marcus stood there for a half-second longer than necessary, then excused himself, and Ryan heard the smallest possible exhale of a laugh in his own chest. Sophie glanced at him. "What?" "Nothing," he said. She looked unconvinced, but let it go. Derek found them a few minutes later, sat 2 seats down from Sophie, and introduced himself without the uncertainty Marcus had shown. He had kids of his own, Ryan had learned, twin boys who were 11 and apparently required a considerable investment of parental energy. He and Sophie had a brief, business-like exchange about what grade she was in and whether she liked science, after which Sophie informed him that she liked river systems specifically, and Derek said that was a very specific interest, and Sophie said she'd found that specific was better than general, and Derek looked at Ryan with an expression that said, "She is definitely yours." Olivia opened the meeting at 10:03, which was 3 minutes late, which was the kind of thing that happened when a room held 400 people and their assembly was imperfect. She didn't use slides. She stood at the podium and talked to the room the way she talked in her office, directly, without performance, without the managed warmth that executives sometimes deploy when they're trying to land messages rather than communicate them. She started with October 14th. She told the story completely. The outage, the 30 engineers, the maintenance contractor who had tried to warn them the day before and had been ignored, and had come into the operations center and fixed in 45 seconds what the team couldn't find in 45 minutes. She described the intake architecture failure, the structural reason the maintenance note never reached the people who needed to read it. She described the audit, the gaps it found, the changes they'd made. Then she described Thomas Reeve. She didn't name Vantage Group by name, legal reasons, but she was specific about what had happened. An internal actor with trusted access had worked deliberately to undermine the company's infrastructure and client relationships for external benefit. She described how it had been found. She described who had found it. The same person who fixed our system in October, Olivia said, is the person who identified this threat, documented it, patched the vulnerability, and prepared the documentation that allowed us to walk into a critical client meeting with honest, complete information. She paused. His name is Ryan Carter. He is our Chief Infrastructure Architect. 5 weeks before he was our Chief Infrastructure Architect, he was a maintenance contractor who repaired our cooling systems and electrical panels and submitted notes through the facilities queue that nobody in the infrastructure division ever read. The room was very quiet. I walked past Ryan in this building for 8 months, Olivia said. I want to say that plainly. I made assumptions about what people in certain roles could contribute, and those assumptions were wrong, and they almost cost this company something that couldn't be recovered. I'm not standing here to perform accountability. I'm standing here because the people in this room deserve to hear the truth about what happened, including the part where the person sitting in my chair failed to see something important. She looked at the room. We have been building something here that had a flaw in it that had nothing to do with our technical architecture. It had to do with which voices we made room for and which ones we filtered out before they could reach us. Fixing that is not a single policy change. It's a practice, every day, in every room. She stepped back from the podium. I'd like Ryan to say a few words. Ryan had not written anything down. He walked to the podium and stood for a moment, looking at 400 people who were looking at him, and behind them, near the aisle, Sophie in her dark blue sweater, watching him with the quiet certainty of someone who has never had cause to doubt the person standing at the front of the room. He thought about what was true. I'm not good at this part, he said. The standing in front of people and talking part. I'm much better with systems. A few people laughed. It was the real kind, not the polite kind, which helped. In October, he said, I watched 30 people try to solve a problem they couldn't solve because they were looking at the symptoms instead of the cause. And I understood that because the system they were working in, the human system, not the technical one, was designed to direct their attention in a specific direction. The system was doing what it was built to do. The problem was that it had been built with a blind spot in it. He paused. I'm not going to tell you that I handled October gracefully. I didn't. I stood in the back of that room for longer than I should have because I was running my own calculation. The one that tells you that walking up to a group of credentialed professionals and saying, you found what they missed is a gamble that usually doesn't pay off the way it should. He looked at the room. I've run that calculation a lot over the past 3 years, and it's taught me something that I want to say out loud because I think it matters. The room was still. The calculation is wrong, Ryan said. Not strategically wrong. It's often strategically correct. The gamble usually doesn't pay off. People usually don't listen the first time to someone who doesn't look like the person they expected to have the answer. The calculation is accurate. He paused. It's wrong in a different way. It's wrong because making the calculation, deciding whether or not to offer what you know based on how you expect to be received, is a form of participation in the system that created the blind spot. Every time I ran that calculation and stayed quiet, I was helping build the wall I was standing on the wrong side of. He wasn't looking at his hands or the podium. He was looking at the room. Not performing the looking, just actually looking. At the specific faces of people in their chairs, engineers and directors and executive assistants, and the guy from the contractor parking office who was sitting in the third row and had apparently been included in mandatory, which Ryan was glad about. What I'm saying is not that the system is everyone else's fault. I had a role in it too. We all do. Every time we decide whether to speak based on who's listening instead of whether the thing is worth saying, we're building something. He let that sit for a moment. The question is whether it's the thing we actually want to build. He thought about Nathan Fisk, who had been handed a story that made a wrong thing feel right, and had acted on it because the story fit the shape of something he already believed. He thought about Derek, who had almost laughed in the operations center and then hadn't been able to stop thinking about the almost laugh for days. He thought about Marcus, who had come to an electrical room in a blazer to say something he didn't have to say. "The people in this room are not bad people," Ryan said. "I want to be clear about that, because I think the story of what happened here can be told in a way that makes it about individual villains and heroes, and that would be the wrong story to take away from it." He paused. "Thomas Reeve was a genuine bad actor. That's real. But the conditions that made his plan almost work, the blind spots, the intake failures, the filtering systems, those weren't his creation. They were already here. He just knew how to use them." The room received that in silence. "Fixing those conditions is slow work," Ryan said. "It doesn't happen in one meeting or one policy document or one story of someone getting the recognition they deserved after being overlooked. It happens in the small choices. Who you listen to before you know their title. Whose note you read before you check the source. Whether you tell a colleague they were right about something even when it cost you something to say it." He thought of Marcus's visit to the electrical room, Derek's visit to the contractor office. Those things matter more than the big moments. The big moments are just when you find out what the small ones have been building toward. He was close to done. He could feel it. The place where a thing has said what it needs to say, and continuing past it becomes decoration. "I want to tell you one more thing," he said, "because I think it's the truest thing I have, and I'd rather say the truest thing than the most impressive one." He looked at the room. 3.5 years ago, I lost my wife. I sold everything I had to try to keep her here, and I couldn't. And afterward, I was a person with a daughter and a skill set and no runway, and a very specific knowledge of what it feels like to be invisible to rooms that had previously been happy to have you in them. The room was very still. "I'm not telling you that for sympathy," he said. "I'm telling you because the invisibility taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. It taught me that most people who are invisible in the rooms they're in are not invisible because they have nothing to offer. They're invisible because the rooms haven't been built to see them yet." He paused. "We get to decide what we build. That's it. That's the whole thing. Every day, in every room, with every person whose note you read or don't read, whose idea you hear before you check their badge, you're deciding what to build." He looked at the room one more time. "I hope we build something worth the effort." He stepped back from the podium. The applause started in the middle of the room and moved outward, and it was the kind of applause that has some weight behind it. Not the reflexive kind, not the kind that fills a silence, the kind that means people were actually in the room with you while you were talking. Ryan walked off the stage and back up the aisle toward his seat, and when he reached the row where Sophie was sitting, she was on her feet, which he hadn't expected, and her face had the expression it got when she was feeling something too large for her face to fully contain. He sat down next to her. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she leaned in close and said quietly, against the continuing applause, "That's my dad." She said it to no one in particular, not performing it, not projecting it, just saying the true thing in the way that children say true things, without calculation, without wondering whether the moment was big enough to deserve it. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned in, and the applause continued around them, and Ryan Carter sat in a chair in a building where he had fixed cooling systems and electrical panels, and eventually something more than that, and let himself be exactly where he was. The weeks that followed were not a resolution so much as a continuation, which was the honest shape of how things actually went when you'd been through something significant. The story didn't end clean. Clean endings were for summaries, not for lives. The 90-day Archway security review went well. Derek turned out to be exactly the kind of support staff Ryan had hoped for. Thorough in the technical work, improved in the interpersonal work, with the specific quality of someone who is trying to be better at something and knows the trying is going to be visible. Clifton Marsh's security consultant ran an independent parallel review and found nothing the Meridian team hadn't already flagged and addressed. The contract was renewed for 3 years. 2 other enterprise clients had reached out after the Archway review's results circulated quietly in the industry, not to challenge Meridian's stability, but to ask how they'd handled the internal security situation. because they'd heard the transparency angle and found it unusual enough to be interesting. Olivia handled both calls herself. Nathan Fisk came to Ryan's office one afternoon, about 6 weeks after the transfer he'd requested. He stood in the doorway in the same tentative way Derek had stood in the contractor office doorway, with the same unresolved something in his expression. "I've been thinking about what you said," Nathan said, "when you came to find me, that I made a mistake based on information given to me deliberately to make that mistake likely." "Yeah," Ryan said. "I've been thinking about whether that's too generous, whether I should have known better." Ryan looked at him. "Should you have gone outside the formal authorization channels for what Thomas asked you to do?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "No. That's the part you own," Ryan said. "The rest is on him." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to do something that mattered," he said. "He told me I was finding vulnerabilities that the infrastructure team was too resistant to look for, that I was actually helping." He looked at the floor briefly. "I wanted that to be true." "I know," Ryan said. "That's the part I keep coming back to. That wanting it to be true is what made it easy for him." Ryan thought about that. About the specific mechanism of manipulation that worked, not because people were foolish or careless, but because they had real desires that could be aimed at false targets. "Yeah," he said. "That's right. And knowing that doesn't make you immune to it happening again. It just makes you more careful about when you're being offered what you want to hear." Nathan looked at him. "How do you stay careful about that, without just distrusting everything?" It was a real question. Ryan gave it a real answer. "You stay anchored to specifics. When someone tells you something that lets you do what you already wanted to do, you ask what the concrete evidence is. Not because people are lying, usually they're not, but because wanting something to be true is not the same as evidence that it is." He paused. "The formal channels exist for a reason. When someone says to go around them, that's the moment to slow down, not speed up." Nathan nodded. He stood there for another moment. "Thank you," he said, "for how you handled it." "You cooperated fully," Ryan said. "That took something." "It took less than not cooperating would have taken eventually," Nathan said. Ryan almost smiled. "That's a very accurate way to look at it." Nathan left. Ryan turned back to his work and thought briefly about the texture of what Nathan had said, that wanting something to be true made the wanting into a liability. He thought about that in relation to himself, on the nights when he'd been running his own calculations about what rooms would and wouldn't receive him. The wanting to be seen had made him careful in ways that were sometimes right and sometimes just self-protective. Learning the difference was slow work. He and Olivia had a standing Tuesday afternoon check-in that had developed organically over the first month and was now simply part of the week's structure. They talked about the infrastructure roadmap, the audit findings, the organizational changes that were moving slowly but moving. And sometimes they talked about other things, not in the way of people becoming friends exactly, but in the way of colleagues who have been through something together and have developed a specific mutual respect that includes the honesty of saying things that aren't on the agenda. One Tuesday in December, Olivia said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can try," Ryan said. "When you were here for 8 months," she said, "doing the maintenance work, did you ever think about leaving, going somewhere you'd be seen more quickly?" He thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," he said, "when the calculation was running particularly loud, when I'd had a long day and came home and Sophie was asleep and I was thinking about where I was versus where I'd been." He paused. "But I had Sophie in a good school. I had a predictable schedule. I had a building where I understood the infrastructure at a level that kept my skills sharp, even though nobody knew it." He looked at the window. "And I think, somewhere underneath the practical reasons, I knew that leaving every room where I wasn't immediately seen was just another version of running the calculation. Eventually, I had to stay somewhere long enough to find out what happened when I stopped optimizing for how I expected to be received." Olivia was quiet for a moment. And this was the room. Turned out to be. She looked at the window too, at the city below doing its December things, the early dark coming faster now, the lights more visible. "I've been thinking about what you said at the all hands, about how the conditions that made Thomas's plan viable weren't his creation, that they were already here. Yeah. I built some of those conditions, she said, without knowing I was building them. I built a company that was efficient and credentialed and had very good systems for elevating certain kinds of expertise and very poor systems for finding others. She paused. I don't know how to fully fix that. I don't think I do know, but I've been thinking about it differently since October. Differently how? She considered. Like it's infrastructure, she said. Not a culture initiative, not a values statement. Actual infrastructure. The way information moves, the channels it has to travel, the points where it gets filtered or amplified, treating it like a system that can be analyzed and improved rather than a feeling that can be encouraged. Ryan looked at her. That's exactly right. I learned from a good teacher, she said dryly. I fixed a routing table, Ryan said. The rest of it you figured out. She almost smiled. We can disagree about the credit allocation. We can, he said. You're still wrong. She did smile then, fully, which was rare enough that he noticed it. Tuesday, same time next week? Tuesday, same time, he said. December in the city was the way December always was. Faster than you expected, fuller than you'd planned, the calendar filling up in the specific way that the end of a year fills calendars. Ryan navigated it with the practiced efficiency of a single father who had learned that the holidays required logistical management rather than the ambient magic that advertisements suggested they would spontaneously produce. Sophie had a school concert the second Thursday of December. She played the recorder, which she was adequate at and would be the first to acknowledge, and stood in the second row with 11 other third graders and played the 3 songs they'd rehearsed since October with the determined expression of someone who had practiced and was now executing the practice. Ryan sat in a folding chair in the school gymnasium with approximately 200 other parents and grandparents and filmed 17 minutes of it on his phone, of which about 4 minutes would be worth watching, and clapped until his hands were slightly red when it was done. On the drive home, Sophie sat in the back seat and said, "The sound system in that gym is terrible." "The music was good," Ryan said. "The music was fine," Sophie said. "We've been better." "The music was good," Ryan said again. She looked out the window. "Did you invite Olivia?" He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "To your school concert?" "She could have come." "That's not really how that works, Bug." "Why not?" He thought about how to explain the particular contours of professional relationships to an 8-year-old who had met Olivia Bennett once at the all-hands meeting for about 45 seconds, during which Olivia had crouched to Sophie's level and said it was good to finally meet her. And Sophie had said she'd heard a lot about her too, which had produced an expression on Olivia's face that Ryan had found difficult to interpret and still thought about occasionally. "It's complicated," he said. Sophie made the sound she made when she found an explanation insufficient. "She came and said hi to me after the meeting," she said. "She seemed nice." "She is," Ryan said. "Complicated and nice are not mutually exclusive." Sophie appeared to consider this. "You should invite her to the next one," she said, "if there is one. There's a spring concert." "There you go," Sophie said, with the finality of a case being closed. He didn't respond to that, which Sophie took as the victory it was. They drove home through the December streets, the Christmas lights beginning to appear in windows, the city dressed in its seasonal version of itself, and Ryan thought about a spring concert and thought about complicated and nice, and let the thought sit where it was without doing anything with it. Some things developed at their own speed. He'd learned that too. The last week of December, Ryan was in his office finishing the year-end documentation review when he found the note. Not a dramatic one, not a message or a revelation, just a printout that someone had slipped under his door, which he noticed when he stood up to get his jacket. He picked it up. It was a copy of the maintenance note he had submitted on October 13th, the one flagging the routing anomaly, the one closed as outside the scope of contractor observations. At the bottom of the copy, someone had written in pen, in handwriting he didn't recognize. "You were right. We should have listened. Facilities, Level B." He stood there holding it for a moment. He didn't know who had left it. He probably never would. The maintenance staff rotated, and the person who had written it hadn't signed a full name. Just the fact of it. Someone, somewhere in the building's lower floors, had read the note in the incident record that Ryan had required to be preserved with its original timestamp and had found this small way to say the thing that mattered to them. He set it on his desk next to the yellow legal pad. He thought about all the notes that had never been read, not just in this building, in every building like it, in every organization that had built channels designed to manage information rather than receive it. All the people who had written down what they saw and sent it somewhere it would be filtered and reduced and filed and lost. Most of those notes would never be found. Most of those people would never get the acknowledgement that someone had written on this printout in careful handwriting on the last week of December. That was the honest version of the story he'd been through. Not the version where the invisible person gets seen and everything corrects cleanly, but the version where one person gets seen in one building because of a specific combination of circumstances and timing and his own refusal to stay quiet past a certain threshold of cost. And that was real, and it mattered, and it was not enough. It was a start, though. He put the printout in his desk drawer, finished packing up, turned off the light. He picked Sophie up from the after-school program at 5:15, 4 minutes late because of traffic on Clement, which she accepted with the air of someone extending a grace they've been extending for years. On the way home, she told him about the book she was reading, historical fiction, something about a girl who worked on a railroad in the 1800s. And he listened and asked questions, and the city moved past the windows in the early dark of December. He was not the same person he had been in October, but he was not entirely different either. He was still the person who repaired what was broken and flagged, what was at risk, and came home on time and helped with fractions and kept the refrigerator stocked and sat at the kitchen table at midnight when something needed thinking through. Those things had not changed. They were not supposed to change. They were the part of himself he had protected through the years when other parts had been stripped away, and they remained intact, and he was glad of that in the uncomplicated, certain way that you can only be glad of something you've actually had to hold on to. Sophie had a book in her lap and was reading in the moving car, which she wasn't supposed to do because it gave her a headache. And he didn't say anything, because some things weren't worth the argument, and the streetlights were good, and the book was clearly good, and she was fine, and they were almost home. "Dad," she said, without looking up. "Yeah. Do you think the girl on the railroad knew she was going to be important? Like, while it was happening?" He thought about it. "I think she probably just thought she was working," he said, "and getting through the day." Sophie nodded, still reading. "That makes sense," she said. They turned onto their street. He found a parking spot on the first pass, which almost never happened, and he took it as the small gift it was. The ordinary luck of an ordinary evening, the day done and the night ahead, and the two of them going inside, and whatever came next coming at its own speed, in its own time.